Power doesn't announce itself with trumpets or gilded thrones. It walks into rooms and watches grown men forget how to breathe. Duke Cedric Ashmont learned this truth the night his father's throat was cut by men who believed mercy was weakness. Men who discovered too late that the boy watching from the shadows understood the lesson perfectly. 20 years later, in the frost-locked wasteland of the northern marches, where survival devours sentiment and winter kills more efficiently than any executioner, Cedric ruled not through birthright, but through the kind of fear that makes nobles check their wine before drinking and count their children before sleeping. He was the monster the realm needed when chaos threatened to swallow everything, and the monster they despised when order was restored. But monsters don't fall in love. They become obsessed. And when a disgraced noblewoman arrived at his gates as payment for her father's treachery, carrying nothing but shame and a spine that refused to break, Cedric Ashmont made a choice that would burn the kingdom to ash. Stay with me. Watch what happens when the most dangerous man in the realm decides something belongs to him. Because this isn't a fairy tale about redemption. This is a story about what men become when the world teaches them that love is just another form of conquest. The northern wind carried ash through the corridors of Thornhaven Keep, a fortress that looked less like a home and more like a scar carved into the mountainside. It was the kind of place where warmth went to die, where stone walls wept with condensation, and where servants moved through shadows like ghosts afraid to be seen. The architecture itself seemed designed to crush hope. Narrow windows that let in razor-thin light, ceilings that pressed down like coffin lids, hallways that twisted into themselves until you forgot which direction led to freedom. Cedric Ashmont stood in the war chamber on the eastern tower, staring at maps that meant nothing anymore. 6 months ago, the king had stripped him of 3 territories for what the royal court called excessive force during a border dispute. Excessive force. As if there was a polite way to handle raiders who burned villages and left children nailed to barn doors. As if the nobles sipping wine in the capital understood what it meant to rule lands where winter and violence were the only constants. The king wanted civility from a man he'd sent to govern hell itself. Cedric's hand rested on the pommel of his sword, not the ceremonial blade nobles wore to court, but the working steel he'd carried since he was 16. Scratched, notched, stained with rust that might have been blood depending on who was asking. His reflection caught in the polished war table. Tall frame wrapped in black wool and leather, dark hair long enough to tie back when he didn't want it in his face during a fight, and eyes the color of iron left in a forge too long, cold, flat. The kind of eyes that made men confess to crimes they didn't commit just to stop him looking at them. He was 38 years old and had been ruling the northern marches since he was 19. Most men didn't survive that long in this position. Behind him, boots struck stone with military precision. Captain Gareth Vane entered without knocking, one of the few privileges Cedric allowed his head of guard. Gareth was built like a siege weapon, scarred from a decade of fighting beside Cedric in every miserable conflict the North had vomited up, and smart enough to know when his duke was in the kind of mood that made even loyalty feel dangerous. "News from the capital," Gareth said, dropping a sealed letter on the table. "Royal wax, the king's personal seal." Cedric didn't touch it. "Read it." Gareth broke the seal with his thumb, scanned the contents, and his jaw tightened. "They're sending someone." "Who?" "Collateral. For Lord Hadrian Vale's debts." Gareth's voice carried the faint distaste of a man who'd seen too many nobles trade human beings like livestock. "His daughter, Seraphina. She arrives tomorrow." Cedric finally looked at the letter. The king's handwriting was elegant, the kind of script taught to children who grew up in palaces instead of killing fields. The message was clear. Lord Hadrian Vale had conspired against the crown, failed, and was now paying his debts the way desperate men always did, with whatever they had left. In this case, his daughter would serve as a permanent guest at Thornhaven Keep, a polite term for hostage, ensuring Hadrian's continued cooperation and silence. The king had decided Cedric's fortress was the perfect prison for a disgraced noblewoman. "What did Vale do?" Cedric asked. "Funded a separatist movement in the eastern provinces. Got caught when one of his co-conspirators turned informant." Gareth shrugged. "The crown wants him broken but visible. Killing him makes him a martyr. This makes him a lesson." Cedric studied the letter. Between the formal language, he could read the real message. We're sending you a problem because you're good at making problems disappear. The king knew Cadric's reputation, knew that noble women sent to Thornhaven Keep didn't leave. Not because Cadric harmed them, he wasn't that kind of monster, but because the north was the edge of the map where the crown sent people it wanted forgotten. She's not a prisoner, Cadric said quietly. No, Gareth agreed. She's leverage. The distinction mattered. Prisoners could be ransomed. Leverage was permanent. Cadric walked to the window. Beyond the keep, the northern territories stretched like an open wound, forests thick enough to hide armies, mountains sharp enough to kill climbers for sport, and villages scattered across the wasteland like dice thrown by a drunk god. He'd spent 20 years keeping this region from tearing itself apart, and his reward was exile disguised as duty. The nobles in the capital called him brutal. Necessary, but distasteful. The kind of man you needed when things got ugly, but pretended not to know when the crisis passed. They'd sent him a noblewoman because they knew he wouldn't touch her, because Cadric Ashmont didn't indulge in cruelty for its own sake. He was efficient, clinical. He killed when necessary and ruled with the kind of iron discipline that kept the North from collapsing into chaos. But he didn't torture, didn't rape, didn't play games with people's suffering. That wasn't morality. It was practicality. Fear worked best when it was predictable. When people knew exactly what would happen if they stepped out of line, unpredictable monsters got assassinated. Prepare the East Wing, Cadric said. She'll have her own chambers, postguards at her door, but keep them subtle. I don't want her feeling like a prisoner, even if that's what she is. Gareth nodded. And if she tries to leave, she won't. Cadric's voice was flat. She's a noblewoman who just watched her father's entire house collapse. She knows there's nowhere to run. Gareth left, boots echoing down the corridor until silence reclaimed the room. Cadric stood alone in the war chamber, staring at maps of territories he no longer controlled, and felt the familiar weight of isolation settle across his shoulders like a cloak made of iron. This was his life. Command without companionship, power without connection. He'd built Thornhaven into a fortress that could withstand siege and rebellion, but somewhere in the process, he'd made it a place where nothing warm could survive. His father used to say that men who ruled through fear died alone. Cadric had stopped caring about dying a long time ago. Serafina Vale arrived the next afternoon under skies the color of old bruises. The carriage that brought her was royal property, black lacquered wood with the crown's seal stamped in gold, but it looked like a hearse. Appropriate, Cadric thought, watching from the battlements as it crawled up the mountain road toward Thornhaven's gates. The woman inside was being delivered to a kind of death. Not physical. Worse, the slow erasure of identity that came from being forgotten by everyone who mattered. He didn't go down to greet her. That was a job for the steward, a rail-thin man named Percival, who managed the keep's daily operations with the joyless efficiency of someone who'd given up on happiness decades ago. Cadric watched from above as the carriage doors opened and a figure stepped out into the courtyard. Lady Serafina Vale was not what he expected. Most noble women arrived at Thornhaven broken, crying, begging for clemency or mercy or some fantasy where their father's crimes could be undone. They wore their suffering like jewelry, displayed their victimhood as if tragedy made them special. Cadric had seen it a dozen times. The performance of feminine helplessness designed to extract sympathy from men stupid enough to believe tears were currency. Serafina didn't cry. She stood in the courtyard with her hands folded in front of her, dressed in dark traveling clothes that looked expensive once, but had been worn too many times without proper care. Her hair was black, pulled back in a severe style that exposed a face built from sharp angles, high cheekbones, narrow jaw, eyes that looked like they'd been carved from flint. She wasn't beautiful in the way court ladies were beautiful. No softness, no decoration. She looked like someone who'd been filed down to edges and had decided that was fine. She looked like someone who'd already survived worse than this. Percival was speaking to her, probably delivering the standard welcome speech about how Thornhaven Keep operated and what was expected of her. Serafina listened without reaction, nodded once, and followed him inside without looking back at the carriage, or the guards, or the mountains that now formed her prison walls. Cadric stayed on the battlements for another hour, watching the courtyard empty, and tried to ignore the strange feeling settling in his chest. Interest. That was dangerous. He didn't speak to her for 3 days. It was a tactic he'd perfected over years of managing hostages, prisoners, and political pawns. Let them settle. Let them understand the weight of their situation without interference. Most people broke during the silence, invented terrors in their own minds that were worse than anything he could actually do. By the time he finally met them, they were already defeated. But on the fourth morning, Gareth brought him a report that changed the schedule. "She's been asking questions," Gareth said. They were in the armory, a long stone room filled with weapons that actually got used instead of decorating walls. Kaedric was inspecting a shipment of crossbows from a manufacturer in the western provinces. Substandard craftsmanship. The triggers stuck. He'd have to send them back with a letter explaining that functional equipment wasn't optional. "What kind of questions, Beatrix?" Kaedric asked, not looking up. "About the keep's defenses, guard rotations, supply lines." Gareth's tone carried a hint of amusement. "She's been polite about it. Frames everything like curiosity, but she's mapping us out." Kaedric set down the crossbow. "She thinks she can escape. Or she's just smart enough to understand her situation." Gareth leaned against a weapon rack. "Most hostages pretend nothing's wrong. Act like they're visiting family. She's studying the cage. That was interesting. Most noblewomen sent to Thornhaven spent their time weeping or writing letters to relatives who wouldn't answer. Seraphina was doing reconnaissance." "Where is she now?" Kaedric asked. "Library." The library was one of the few rooms in Thornhaven that didn't feel like punishment. Kedric's mother had built it before she died, filled it with books she'd collected from across the realm. After she was gone, Kaedric had maintained it out of habit more than sentiment. He didn't read for pleasure, but he understood that knowledge was a weapon, and weapons needed maintenance. He found Seraphina sitting in the alcove near the southern windows, surrounded by books about military history and territorial law. She'd pulled her hair back, revealing a bruise on her neck, faded, but still visible. Someone had grabbed her recently, hard enough to leave marks. She looked up when he entered, and for the first time Kaedric saw her eyes clearly, dark, cold, absolutely devoid of fear. "Duke Ashmont," she said. Not a question. A statement. "Lady Vale." He moved into the room slowly, giving her space to retreat if she wanted. She didn't move. "I hope Thornhaven is comfortable. It's a fortress designed to break people's spirits through architecture alone." Her voice was low, controlled. "But the library is nice." Most people lied when Kaedric asked how they were settling in. Told him everything was fine, perfect. "Thank you for your hospitality." Seraphina just told him the truth, like it was a weapon she was testing to see if it would cut. "You've been asking about guard rotations," Kaedric said. "I have." "Planning an escape?" "Evaluating whether it's possible." She closed the book in her lap. "It's not. You run this place like a military installation. 3 shifts of guards, overlapping schedules, every entrance monitored. Even if I made it past the walls, I'm 2 weeks' travel from the nearest neutral territory through mountains that kill experienced climbers." She met his eyes. "So, no, I'm not planning an escape. I'm just confirming I'm in prison." Kaedric studied her. Most hostages broke under pressure. Seraphina seemed to sharpen. "This isn't a prison," he said. "You're a guest. Guests can leave." "Fair point." Kaedric moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard. "Your father conspired against the crown. You're here to ensure his continued cooperation. That's politics, not punishment." "My father is a coward who used his children as shields the moment his conspiracy collapsed." Seraphina's voice was flat. "I'm here because he gave me a way to save himself. Don't dress it up as politics." The bitterness in her voice was a living thing. Kaedric recognized it. He'd felt that same corrosive anger when he was younger, when he realized the people who were supposed to protect him were just as capable of betrayal as any enemy. "You're angry," Kaedric observed. "I'm realistic." Seraphina stood, and he realized she was taller than most women he'd met. Not tall enough to meet his eyes, but tall enough that she didn't have to crane her neck. Anger is what you feel when you think situations can change. I know better. Then what do you feel? She considered the question like it was a trap, and maybe it was. "Curious," she finally said. "Everyone in the capital talks about Duke Ashmont like you're some kind of northern nightmare. The king's attack dog, a man so brutal even the crown is afraid of him." She tilted her head slightly. But you maintain a library. You haven't threatened me. You're asking questions instead of giving orders. So I'm curious which version is real. Both, Kedrick said simply. I'm brutal when brutality is required, civil when it's not. The difference is knowing which situation calls for which approach. And which situation is this? That depends on you. Serafina smiled, and it was the coldest expression Kedrick had seen in years. You want me to believe I have agency here? That if I behave, if I'm pleasant and obedient, you'll treat me well. But we both know that's a lie. I'm leverage, a political tool. What happens to me has nothing to do with my behavior and everything to do with whether my father stays useful to the crown. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't entirely right either. Your father's usefulness is temporary, Kedrick said. Eventually the crown will extract everything valuable from him and discard what's left. When that happens, you'll still be here. So your behavior does matter. Because the question isn't whether you leave Thornhaven, you won't. The question is what your life looks like while you're here. Serafina absorbed that, and something shifted in her expression. Not defeat, recognition. The look of someone who'd just confirmed what they suspected. You're not planning to kill me, she said. No. Or harm me. No. Then what am I to you? Kedrick considered lying, considered telling her she was nothing, just another obligation in a fortress full of them. But something about the way she stood there, spine straight, hands steady, refusing to flinch, made him tell the truth. I don't know yet, he said. For a long moment they stood in silence. Outside, ravens circled the keep's towers, their calls sharp and mocking. I won't pretend to like this, Serafina finally said. I won't perform gratitude or play the role of the rescued damsel. If you're looking for someone to validate your mercy, find someone else. I don't need validation, Kedrick replied. I need people who understand reality. You clearly do. Then we have an understanding. We do. She picked up the book she'd been reading, a military history of the northern campaigns, and sat back down, effectively dismissing him. Kedrick left the library feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Intrigued. That night, he ordered Gareth to increase the guard rotation around Serafina's chambers. She try something? Gareth asked. No, but she's smart enough too. I want to know where she is at all times. Gareth frowned. You worried she'll escape? No? Kedrick stared at the map on his desk. I'm worried about who might try to take her, because that was the truth he hadn't said in the library. Serafina wasn't just leverage against her father, she was leverage against Kedrick. The moment anyone realized he cared about what happened to her, even slightly, she became a weapon aimed directly at his throat, and he was already starting to care. That was the problem with being the realm's monster. You spent so long pushing people away that when someone finally refused to flinch, it felt like finding water in a desert. Dangerous, necessary, impossible to ignore. 3 weeks passed. Serafina established routines. Morning walks along the battlements where the wind cut like knives. Afternoons in the library, reading military strategy and territorial law. Evenings in her chambers, where servants reported she wrote letters she never sent, practiced correspondence to family members who'd stopped acknowledging her existence. She didn't try to escape, didn't cause problems, didn't throw tantrums or demand special treatment. She just existed with the same cold efficiency Kedrick used to run his fortress. It was unsettling. Most hostages eventually broke under the weight of isolation, started talking to themselves, stopped eating, descended into the kind of madness that came from being erased by the world. Serafina seemed to sharpen instead, like she was using the isolation to file herself down into something harder. Kedrick found himself watching her, not constantly, but enough. He'd position himself on the battlements during her morning walks, stand near the library windows when she was reading, find excuses to check guard reports from her section of the keep. Gareth noticed, of course. You're observing her, Gareth said one evening. They were in the war chamber reviewing supply requisitions, boring logistics that kept the fortress functional. She's a security concern, Kedrick replied without looking up. She's a noble woman who spends her days reading. If that's a security concern, we're in trouble. Kadrick set down the document he was pretending to read. What's your point? My point is, you've never paid this much attention to a hostage before. Usually you settle them in, confirm they're not a threat, and forget they exist. Gareth's expression was carefully neutral. This one you're tracking like she's enemy reconnaissance. She's different. How? Kedrick didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound insane. Because she doesn't break? Because she looks at me like I'm a problem to solve instead of a monster to fear? Because she's the first person in years who feels real instead of performing some version of themselves they think I want to see? She's intelligent, Kedrick finally said. Intelligence is dangerous. So are you. Hasn't stopped you from existing. Oh. Kedrick ignored that and went back to the supply documents, but Gareth's words lingered like smoke. He was paying too much attention to her. He knew it. But knowing something was dangerous and stopping yourself from doing it were different skills, and Kedrick had never been good at the second one. The breaking point came on a Thursday. Kedrick was in the throne room, a massive chamber with vaulted ceilings and walls decorated with weapons from defeated enemies, when Lord Marcus Thorne arrived without warning. Marcus was everything Kedrick despised about Southern nobility, rich from inherited wealth instead of work, influential through manipulation instead of competence, charming in the way poisonous things often were, with a smile that promised friendship while his eyes calculated how to use you. He was also the crown's investigator, sent north to assess whether the territories Kedrick lost still required supervision, which meant Marcus was here to determine if Kedrick could be stripped of more power. Duke Ashmont, Marcus said, entering the throne room like he owned it. Still ruling from your cave in the mountains. How delightfully medieval. Kedrick remained seated, didn't stand, didn't offer the courtesy of greeting, just watched Marcus approach with the same expression he'd use watching a rat cross the floor. Lord Thorne, the Crown didn't inform me you were visiting. Surprise inspections are more honest. Marcus stopped at the base of the throne platform, smiling like they were old friends. I'm here to evaluate the northern territories, make sure everything is running smoothly, ensure the king's interests are being properly managed. Translation: I'm here to find reasons to take more of your power. Everything is fine, Kedrick said flatly. I'm sure it is, but I'll need to conduct interviews, review records, speak with key individuals in the region. Marcus's smile widened, including Lady Seraphina Vale. I understand she's currently residing here. Kedrick's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his chest. Lady Vale is a guest. She's not part of your investigation. Actually, she is. Her father's case is still being evaluated. The Crown wants to ensure she's being treated appropriately. Marcus tilted his head. You don't have concerns about that, do you? About how she's being treated? It was a trap. If Kedrick refused access, Marcus would report that he was hiding something. If he allowed it, Marcus would spend time alone with Seraphina, potentially manipulating her testimony or worse. She's free to speak with whoever she wants, Kedrick said, but I'll be present during any official interviews. That would compromise the integrity of the investigation. But then conduct your investigation somewhere else. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Marcus's smile didn't falter, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. The look of a man who just confirmed what he suspected. You're protective of her, some, Marcus observed. Interesting. I'm protective of all guests in my keep. Of course. Marcus stepped back, still smiling. I'll begin my interviews tomorrow. Do make sure Lady Vale is available. He left before Kedrick could respond. Gareth appeared from the side chamber where he'd been listening to the conversation. He's going to use her against you. I know. If he reports that you're showing favoritism toward a hostage, I know. Kedrick stood. Find Seraphina. Bring her here. What are you going to tell her? Yeah. Kedrick stared at the throne room's entrance where Marcus had disappeared. The truth. Seraphina arrived 20 minutes later, escorted by 2 guards who immediately left when Kedrick dismissed them. She stood in the center of the throne room, looking small against the vaulted architecture, and waited for him to explain why she'd been summoned. Kedrick descended from the throne platform, closing the distance between them but stopping before he invaded her space. Lord Marcus Thorne is here. He's investigating the Northern Territories and wants to interview you about your father's case. Serafina's expression didn't change. All right. He's not interested in your father's case. He's looking for leverage against me. Yalmasbokiski. And you think I'll provide it? I think he'll twist whatever you say into something that serves the Crown's agenda. Kedrick kept his voice level. Marcus is a political operative. Everything he does is calculated to advance his position. If he believes you're important to me, he'll use that. Serafina's eyes narrowed slightly. Am I? Important to you? The question landed like a knife between ribs. Kedrick could lie. Should lie. But something about the way she looked at him, direct, unflinching, demanding honesty, even when it was dangerous, made him tell the truth. You're becoming so, he said quietly. For a long moment, Serafina didn't react. Then she laughed, sharp, bitter, devoid of humor. Of course, she said. Of course, the one person who notices I exist is the most dangerous man in the realm. She turned away, pacing across the throne room floor. Do you have any idea what kind of position that puts me in? Yes. Do you care? More than I should. She stopped pacing and looked at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Kedrick saw something other than cold control in her expression. Fear. Not of him. Of the situation. Of what it meant to matter to someone with this much power and this many enemies. What do you want me to do? She asked. During the interview, be careful. Marcus will try to get you to say things that sound innocent but can be used against us both. Don't trust him. Don't give him anything personal. And if he asks about you, about how you've treated me, tell him the truth, that I've been professional, distant, that you're a hostage being held under standard conditions. Kedrick stepped closer, and this time Serafina didn't retreat. Whatever you do, don't let him see that you're anything more than an obligation to me. Even if that's not true anymore? The question hung in the air between them. Kedrick knew the right answer, the safe answer, the answer that would protect them both. But he was tired of lying. Especially then, he said. Serafina held his gaze, and something shifted in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. The look of someone who just realized they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. This is going to end badly, she said quietly. Probably. You should send me away. Trade me to another house. Get me out of Thornhaven before this becomes a problem you can't control. I should, Kedrick agreed. I won't. Why not? Because you're the first person in 20 years who looks at me like I'm human instead of useful. Because you don't flinch. Because you're standing in my throne room telling me to protect myself, even though it would mean losing you. Because I'm selfish, Kedrick said instead. Serafina studied him for a long moment, and then did something that surprised him completely. She smiled. Not the cold, sharp expression she usually wore, something softer, sadder. The smile of someone who recognized their own trap and walked into it anyway. Then I guess we're both damned, she said. And in that moment, standing in the throne room of Thornhaven Keep, while political predators circled outside, Kedrick Ashmont realized he'd made the kind of mistake that destroyed kingdoms. He'd started caring about someone who could be used to destroy him. Woes. Marcus conducted his interview the next morning in the Keep's Solar, a bright room designed to make people feel comfortable while being interrogated. Kedrick insisted on being present despite Marcus's objections, positioning himself near the window where he could watch without interfering. Serafina entered wearing a simple gray dress, hair pulled back, expression neutral. She sat across from Marcus with the same posture she'd use attending a boring lecture, attentive but disengaged. Marcus started with pleasantries. How was she settling in? Was the food acceptable? Did she need anything? Standard questions designed to build rapport before the real interrogation began. Serafina answered politely. Everything was fine. She had no complaints. Duke Ashmont ran an efficient household. And how does the Duke treat you? Marcus asked, his tone casual. I imagine being held as collateral for your father's crimes must be difficult. I'm treated fairly, Serafina replied. I have comfortable quarters, access to the library, freedom to move throughout the keep. But you can't leave. No. Does that bother you? I'm a hostage, Lord Thorn, Being bothered doesn't change my situation. Marcus smiled like he'd expected that answer. You're remarkably pragmatic, Lady Vale. Most women in your position would be far more emotional. Most women in my position weren't raised by Lord Hadrian Vale. Seraphina's voice was flat. My father taught me that emotions are weaknesses people exploit. I learned that lesson very well. From his position by the window, Caedric watched Marcus's expression shift slightly. He was looking for vulnerability, some crack he could exploit. Seraphina was giving him nothing. Has Duke Ashmont ever threatened you? Marcus asked. No. Harmed you? No. Made inappropriate advances? No. Then you'd say your captivity here has been pleasant? It was a trap. If Seraphina said yes, Marcus would report that Caedric was showing favoritism. If she said no, he'd claim abuse. Seraphina saw the trap immediately. My captivity is exactly what it should be, she said carefully. Professional, distant. The Duke treats me like any other political obligation. Necessary, but unremarkable. I'm housed, fed, and ignored. There's nothing pleasant or unpleasant about it. It simply is. Mbowa. Perfect answer. No emotional attachment, no special treatment, just bureaucratic efficiency. Marcus's smile tightened fractionally. You seem quite comfortable with Duke Ashmont's reputation. Most people find him intimidating. Most people haven't lived through what I have. Seraphina met Marcus's eyes. My father used me as a political shield my entire life. I was traded, bartered, promised to strangers, and ultimately discarded the moment I stopped being useful. Duke Ashmont is many things, but at least he's honest about what I am to him. That's more respect than I've gotten from most men. The bitterness in her voice was real, and Caedric realized she wasn't acting. She meant every word, and somehow, in her condemnation of her father, she'd given Marcus nothing he could use. The interview continued for another hour. Marcus probed from different angles, looking for inconsistencies, trying to catch Seraphina in a contradiction. She remained consistent, professional, emotionally detached. By the time it ended, Marcus looked frustrated. Thank you for your time, Lady Vale, he said, standing. I may have follow-up questions. Of course. Seraphina stood as well, and left without looking at Caedric. After she was gone, Marcus turned to Caedric with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She's well-trained, he said. She's honest. Is she? Marcus moved toward the door. I'll be staying another week to complete my investigation. Do try to be hospitable, Duke Ashmont. He left, and Caedric stood alone in the solar, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Seraphina had protected him. She'd lied because everything she'd said about him being distant and unremarkable was a lie now. But she'd lied convincingly enough that Marcus couldn't prove it. She'd chosen his side. That changed everything. He found her that evening on the battlements, standing in her usual spot where the wind was strongest and the view stretched across miles of frozen wasteland. She didn't turn when he approached, just kept staring at the mountains like they held answers she couldn't find. Thank you, Caedric said. For what? For protecting me during the interview. I protected myself. Seraphina finally looked at him. If Marcus reports that you're compromised, the crown will remove you. Install someone else to manage the North. Someone who might not be as professional. That's not why you did it. No? She turned to face him fully. Then why did I do it? Because you've decided I'm worth protecting. Because somewhere in the last month you've started seeing me as something other than your jailer. Because you're as trapped in this as I am. Because you're smart enough to know that whatever this is between us, it's safer kept secret, Caedric said instead. Seraphina laughed quietly. Whatever this is. Very romantic phrasing. Duke Ashmont, I'm not romantic. I'm realistic. Neither am I. She stepped closer, and Caedric felt the shift in air pressure like a storm front moving in. But I need you to understand something. I didn't lie for you because I care about you. I lied because I've spent my entire life being a tool for men who see me as property. And if I have to be property, I'd rather belong to someone who at least treats me like I have a mind. You're not property. Then what am I? The question was a challenge, and Kaedric knew the answer would define everything that came next. "Someone I can't afford to lose," he said. Seraphina's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or fear at hearing the truth spoken aloud. "That's dangerous," she said quietly. "I know. People like Marcus will use it against you." "I know. Then why say it?" "Because I'm tired of lying." They stood on the battlements as night settled over Thornhaven Keep. Two people caught in a situation neither had chosen, both aware they were standing on the edge of something that would either save or destroy them. And in the distance, beyond the mountains, the capital waited with knives sharpened and eyes watching, counting down the moments until Duke Kaedric Ashmont made the kind of mistake that gave them permission to finally end him. The week that followed Marcus Thorne's arrival felt like living inside a drawn blade. Kaedric watched the investigator move through Thornhaven like a predator testing fence lines, interviewing servants, examining supply records, asking questions designed to sound routine, but weren't. Marcus was building a case, not about corruption or mismanagement, but about weakness, about whether the Duke who'd ruled the North through iron discipline for 20 years had finally developed a crack someone could exploit. That crack had a name. Seraphina. Kaedric knew it. Marcus knew it. The only question was whether Marcus could prove it before Kaedric figured out how to eliminate the threat without starting a war with the crown. The problem was that eliminating Marcus wouldn't solve anything. He was just the advanced scout. Behind him stood the entire apparatus of royal power, nobles who wanted Kaedric's territories, advisors who saw his independence as dangerous, a king who tolerated him only because he kept the North stable. If Marcus disappeared, someone else would come. Someone worse. So Kaedric did what he'd always done when surrounded by enemies. He adapted. He stopped visiting Seraphina, stopped positioning himself where he could watch her, stopped asking Gareth for updates about her routines. To anyone observing, Lady Seraphina Vale became exactly what she should be, a hostage who warranted basic care and nothing more. It should have been easy. It wasn't, because every morning when he didn't walk past the library, he thought about her sitting alone, surrounded by military histories. Every evening, when he didn't check the guard reports from her wing, he wondered if she was safe. Every night when he lay awake staring at ceiling beams older than his grandfather, he replayed their conversation on the battlements and heard her voice asking what she was to him. Someone I can't afford to lose. He'd said it, meant it. And now he was losing her anyway because proximity had become too dangerous. This was the cost of carrying in his position. The moment something mattered, it became leverage. And leverage got used until it broke you, or you broke it first. Kaedric had spent 20 years refusing to let anything matter enough to be used against him. Now he was learning that some things mattered whether you allowed them to or not. 3 days into his tactical withdrawal, Gareth found him in the armory inspecting equipment that didn't need inspection. "She's asking about you," Gareth said without preamble. Kaedric continued examining a sword he'd already checked twice. "I'm sure she's curious about many things. She asked if you were ill, if something had happened." Gareth leaned against the weapon rack. She noticed the change. Of course she noticed. Seraphina noticed everything. That was part of what made her dangerous, not to him, but to herself. She saw patterns where other people saw chaos, drew conclusions that were accurate enough to get her killed. "Tell her I'm occupied with administrative duties," Kaedric said. "I did." She didn't believe me. "Then tell her something more convincing." "Like what?" "The truth? That you're avoiding her because Marcus is watching and you can't risk showing interest?" Gareth's voice carried an edge. "She's not stupid. She knows what's happening." Kaedric finally looked up. "Then she understands why this is necessary." "Does she? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're punishing her for a situation she didn't create." Gareth crossed his arms. "You know what happens to people here when they get isolated? They break. She's been here a month, and the only person who treated her like something other than furniture was you. Now you've disappeared. How long before that does damage you can't undo?" The question landed like an accusation because it was one. Kaedric set down the sword carefully, controlling the anger that wanted to surface. "I'm protecting her. By abandoning her. By keeping distance between us so Marcus can't use her to destroy everything I've built here." "Maybe." Gareth moved toward the door, then paused. "Or maybe you're just doing what you always do, pushing people away before they can become problems. Either way, she's suffering for it." He left before Kaedric could respond. Alone in the armory, surrounded by weapons designed to kill efficiently, Kaedric felt the familiar weight of command settle across his shoulders. Every decision came with casualties. You protected what mattered most and accepted the damage to everything else. That was leadership. That was survival. But standing there, he couldn't shake the image of Seraphina sitting alone in the library, realizing she'd been discarded the moment she became inconvenient, just like her father had discarded her. Just like every man in her life had taught her, she was only valuable until she wasn't. Kaedric had promised himself he was different. Apparently, he'd lied. Wipes. That evening, Marcus requested a private dinner with Kaedric in the formal dining hall, a room designed to intimidate through scale and history. Long table made from a single massive oak, walls decorated with weapons taken from defeated enemies. Ceiling so high your voice echoed like you were shouting into a cave. Kaedric arrived exactly on time, dressed in black as always, and found Marcus already seated, wine poured, expression pleasant in the way snakes were pleasant right before they struck. Duke Ashmont. Marcus gestured to the chair opposite him. Thank you for making time. I know you're busy. Kaedric sat without responding. The servants brought food, roasted venison, winter vegetables, bread that was probably the best thing in the keep, but still tasted like survival instead of luxury. He ate mechanically while Marcus made conversation about the weather, the state of the roads, the quality of Thornhaven's wine cellars. Small talk designed to lower defenses. Kaedric waited for this real conversation to start. It came with dessert. I've completed most of my investigation, Marcus said, setting down his wine. The Northern Territories are well managed, efficiently run. Your reputation for brutal competence is well deserved. But, Marcus smiled, but I've noticed something curious during my time here. You run Thornhaven like a military installation. Everything precise, everything controlled. No waste, no sentiment. It's impressive. I'm not hearing a criticism. That's because I'm still deciding if what I've observed is a problem or simply unusual. Marcus leaned forward slightly. You've isolated Lady Seraphina Vale since I arrived. Stopped interacting with her entirely. One might interpret that as appropriate professional distance. Or one might wonder if you're hiding something. There was the knife. Slipped between the ribs so smoothly, Kaedric almost admired the technique. I'm not hiding anything, Kaedric said calmly. Lady Vale is a hostage. My interaction with her was initially necessary to establish her situation. Once that was accomplished, continued interaction became unnecessary. I have territories to govern. Of course. Marcus's smile widened. But doesn't it seem cruel, leaving her completely isolated? She has access to the library, the gardens. She's not imprisoned in her chambers, but she has no companionship, no one to speak with. The servants won't engage with her beyond basic service. She's been cut off from everyone she knew. And now the one person who showed her any attention has withdrawn. Marcus tilted his head. That's a specific kind of suffering. Psychological. The kind that breaks people slowly. Kaedric felt his jaw tighten. Is there a point to this? My point is that you're either remarkably cruel or remarkably afraid. Marcus set down his wine glass with deliberate care. Cruelty I can understand. It's consistent with your reputation. But fear? That would suggest Lady Vale matters to you. And if she matters, that creates vulnerabilities the Crown should know about. There it was. The real accusation. Not that Kaedric was mistreating Seraphina, but that he cared enough about her welfare to alter his behavior. Damned either way. If he maintained distance, Marcus would claim he was cruel. If he showed concern, Marcus would report attachment. The trap had been set perfectly. Kaedric met Marcus's eyes with the flat stare that had made nobles confess to crimes they didn't commit. Lady Vale's psychological state is not my concern beyond ensuring she remains functional enough to serve her purpose as collateral. If isolation damages her, that's unfortunate but irrelevant to my duties. I'm not her caretaker. I'm her jailer. He leaned back. Is that cruel enough for you? Marcus studied him for a long moment, and Kaedric knew he was being evaluated, measured, dissected for signs of dishonesty. Finally, Marcus smiled. I suppose it is. Thank you for clarifying your position, Duke Ashmont. I'll include it in my report. He stood, leaving his dessert untouched, and walked out of the dining hall with the satisfied expression of someone who just confirmed exactly what they suspected. Kaedric remained seated long after Marcus left, staring at his own untouched wine, feeling the weight of what he'd just done. He'd thrown Serafina into the fire to protect himself, called her irrelevant, disposable, a tool whose damage didn't matter. It was the smart move, the strategic move, the move that would keep Marcus from finding the leverage he was hunting for. It was also a betrayal. And sitting alone in the vast dining hall, Kadric realized that protecting his position was starting to cost more than he wanted to pay. Look, Serafina didn't come to breakfast the next morning, or lunch. By dinner, the servants reported she hadn't eaten all day, hadn't left her chambers, hadn't responded when they knocked to deliver food. Gareth brought the news to Kadric's study with an expression that made his opinion very clear without saying a word. "She's not eating," Gareth said. "Some people skip meals. Not like this. The servants say she's shut down. Won't talk. Won't move. Just sits in her room staring at nothing." Gareth's voice was carefully controlled. "They've seen it before. It's how people start breaking." Kadric kept his eyes on the document he was reading. Budget allocations for road maintenance. Boring logistics that kept the North functional and gave him something to focus on other than the growing pit in his stomach. "She'll recover," he said. "Will she?" Gareth moved closer to the desk. "You know what happens to people when they realize they're completely alone. When they understand that no one cares if they live or die. They stop fighting, stop eating, stop existing." He paused. "She's not like the other hostages we've held. She came here already damaged, already abandoned. And then you gave her something, attention, respect, conversation, and took it away without explanation. That's not isolation, that's cruelty. I'm aware. Then do something about it." "I can't." Kadric finally looked up. "Marcus is watching. If I show concern now, everything I said at dinner last night becomes a lie. He'll know I care. He'll report it to the Crown. And then she becomes a weapon aimed directly at me. So you're going to let her break. If that's what it takes to keep her safe long-term, yes." Gareth stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Disappointment, maybe, or disgust. "I followed you for 15 years, fought beside you, watched you make decisions no one else could make. But this?" His voice was quiet. "This is cowardice dressed up as strategy." He left before Kadric could respond. The study fell silent, except for the wind rattling windows and the sound of Kadric's own breathing. Cowardice. Maybe Gareth was right. Maybe hiding behind strategy was just another form of weakness. Maybe men who claimed they were protecting people by abandoning them were just finding sophisticated ways to justify selfishness. Or maybe Kadric was doing exactly what needed to be done in a world where caring about someone made them a target. He didn't know anymore. What he did know was that Serafina was 3 floors above him, shutting down because he'd confirmed what she already believed, that she was disposable. That the moment caring about her became inconvenient, he'd choose self-preservation, just like everyone else in her life. Kadric sat in his study until the candles burned down to stubs, and the darkness felt like something solid pressing against his chest. Then he made a decision that would either save everything or destroy it. He stood up and walked toward Serafina's chambers. The guards outside her door straightened when Kadric appeared, surprise flickering across their faces. He'd made a point of avoiding this wing for days. His presence now was a statement. He didn't care anymore. "Leave," he told the guards. They obeyed without question, boots echoing down the corridor until silence reclaimed the hallway. Kadric knocked once. No response. He tried the door, unlocked, and pushed it open. Serafina's chambers were dark except for moonlight cutting through the windows. She sat in a chair near the fireplace, which was cold and hadn't been lit in hours. Still dressed, hair unpinned, staring at nothing with the kind of empty expression Kadric had seen on soldiers who'd watched their entire units die. She didn't look at him when he entered. "You need to eat," Kadric said. No response. He moved into the room, closing the door behind him. "Serafina, you haven't eaten in over a day. Why does it matter?" Her voice was flat. Mechanical. "You made it very clear I'm irrelevant beyond my function as collateral. Hostages don't need to be happy. They just need to be alive. I'm alive." "You're welcome." The words hit harder than they should have because they were his words, his logic, thrown back at him with surgical precision. Kadric crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair so she'd have to look at him. "I was protecting you." By calling me disposable? By telling Marcus my psychological state doesn't matter? She finally met his eyes, and what Kaedric saw there was worse than anger. It was resignation. You did what every man in my life has done. Pretended I mattered until it became inconvenient. At least my father was honest about using me. You made me think there was something different here. There is.
No, there isn't. Seraphina's voice cracked slightly. You care about me right up until caring becomes dangerous. Then I disappear. That's not protection. That's abandonment with better marketing.
Kedrick absorbed the accusation because it was true. He had abandoned her, had chosen safety over honesty, had done exactly what she'd been conditioned to expect from people.
I'm sorry, he said quietly. Seraphina laughed, bitter, sharp, devoid of humor. You're sorry. How generous. She stood abruptly, forcing him to move back. I don't want your apology. I want you to leave me alone, completely.
Stop pretending you care. Stop these visits where you justify your choices. Just let me fade into the background like every other hostage you've forgotten about. I can't do that. Why not?
You managed it perfectly for the last week, because it was destroying me. The words came out before Kaedric could stop them. Raw, honest, dangerous. Every morning I didn't walk past the library, I thought about you sitting alone.
Every night I convinced myself distance was necessary. I knew I was lying. Marcus is right. You matter to me. And hiding it isn't protecting either of us anymore. It's just making us both miserable. Seraphina stared at him, and for the first time since he'd entered, something other than emptiness flickered in her expression. Fear. Not of him. Of what he was saying. You can't say things like that, she whispered. I know. If Marcus finds out, he already suspects. That's why he's still here. Why he's watching. He knows something shifted between us, and he's waiting for proof. Kaedric stepped closer. So we can keep pretending nothing's there, keep isolating ourselves to maintain appearances, or we can stop lying and deal with whatever comes next. Whatever comes next will destroy you. Seraphina's voice was shaking. The Crown is looking for reasons to strip your power. Marcus will report that you've become attached to a hostage, that you're compromised. They'll use me to dismantle everything you've built here. Probably. Then why are you doing this? Because for 20 years, I've ruled through fear and isolation, and it's kept me alive, but it's also kept me alone, and I'm tired. Kaedric reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. I'm tired of treating connection like weakness, tired of pushing people away because caring makes them targets. I've survived this long by refusing to let anything matter. And maybe that worked when I was younger, but standing here now, watching you shut down because I repeated every betrayal you've already lived through. He stopped, searching for words that didn't sound insane. I'd rather burn everything down than keep existing like this. Seraphina's breath hitched. You don't mean that. I do. You're saying you'd risk your position, your territories, everything you've built. For what? For me? For the chance to stop being the monster everyone believes I am. Kedric's hand found hers, and he felt her fingers trembling. For the chance to prove that men like me can choose something other than power and survival. For a long moment, Seraphina didn't move. Then she pulled her hand back, stepping away from him, and Kaedric felt the rejection like a physical blow. But she didn't tell him to leave. Instead, she moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit mountains, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I've spent my entire life being used by powerful men. My father used me for political alliances. Other nobles used me for access to my family's resources. Even after my father's conspiracy collapsed, the Crown used me as leverage. She turned to face him. Every time I thought someone cared, it turned out they just needed something. And the moment I stopped being useful, I was discarded. I'm not them. How do I know that? How do I know this isn't just another version of the same pattern? You need something from me. Companionship, validation, whatever fills the void left by 20 years of isolation. And when you get it, or when it becomes too expensive to maintain, I'll be discarded again. The accusation was fair. Kedric had given her no reason to trust him, had proven through his actions that self-preservation always won, but he was done playing that game. You don't know, he said simply. I can't prove my intentions, can't promise I won't make mistakes or hurt you again. All I can offer is honesty. I care about you. It's inconvenient, dangerous, potentially disastrous for both of us, but it's real, and I'm choosing to stop hiding it regardless of what that costs. Seraphina studied him with an expression that made Kaedric feel exposed in ways combat never had, like she was dissecting him, measuring whether the man in front of her matched the words coming out of his mouth. "If I believe you," she finally said, "if I let myself trust this, and you betray me, I won't." "You can't promise that." "No one can." She moved closer, and Kaedric saw tears gathering in her eyes that she refused to let fall. "But I'm going to choose to believe you anyway, because the alternative is spending the rest of my life alone in this fortress, and I've discovered I'd rather risk being destroyed than accept that as my future. Then we're both damned."
"We are." Serafina reached up slowly, her hand trembling as it touched his face.
"And I'm tired of being smart, tired of protecting myself, tired of surviving instead of living." Kaedric covered her hand with his own, and in that moment, everything he'd built over 20 years, the walls, the distance, the carefully maintained isolation, crumbled completely. He kissed her, not gently, not carefully, like a man who'd been drowning and finally found air. Serafina responded with equal desperation, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Kaedric realized that whatever strategic control he'd maintained over the situation was gone. This wasn't careful, wasn't smart, wasn't the calculated decision of a man who'd survived through ruthless pragmatism. This was need, raw, honest, terrifying. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Serafina looked at him with an expression that mixed fear and exhilaration and resignation. "Marcus will find out," she said. "I know. The Crown will use this against you. I know. You'll lose everything, probably." Kaedric pulled her against him, and she buried her face against his chest. "But I've already lost the one thing that made any of it worth having. Keeping you at distance destroyed something in me I didn't know could break. So if the choice is between maintaining power through isolation or risking everything for connection, I'm choosing you." Serafina's arms tightened around him. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." "Agreed. And the most honest thing anyone's ever said to me." They stood together in the dark room while moonlight painted silver across the floor, and the future waited outside like wolves circling a wounded deer. Kaedric knew this was a mistake, knew he'd just handed his enemies the exact weapon they needed to destroy him, knew that loving someone in his position was the surest way to get them killed. But he was done pretending he could control everything through strategy and fear. Some things mattered more than survival, and if caring about Serafina Vale was going to destroy him, then at least he'd go down having chosen something other than the emptiness that had defined his life for 20 years. Marcus left Thornhaven 3 days later with a smile that promised future consequences. Kaedric watched from the battlements as the investigator's carriage disappeared down the mountain road, carrying whatever report he'd compiled back to the capital. The contents of that report would determine whether Kaedric kept his position or found himself stripped of power and possibly executed for treason. He should have been terrified. Instead, he felt calm. Serafina joined him on the battlements, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. She'd stopped hiding in her chambers, stopped pretending nothing had changed. The servants had noticed. The guards had noticed. By now, Marcus had definitely noticed. The secret was out. "How long do we have?" Serafina asked. "Until Marcus reaches the capital and delivers his report?" 3 weeks. Until the Crown decides what to do about it." He shrugged. "Could be months. Could be never. Depends on whether they consider me valuable enough to keep despite the complication. And if they don't, then we'll deal with it." Serafina looked at him with an expression that mixed amusement and disbelief. "You're remarkably calm for someone who just committed political suicide." "I've spent 20 years afraid of this exact scenario." Kaedric turned to face her fully. Afraid that caring about someone would give my enemies leverage. That attachment would compromise my ability to rule. That love was just another form of weakness. And now it's happened, and I'm discovering that I don't regret it. You will. When the Crown strips your titles, when they send soldiers to arrest you, when this all collapses because you chose feeling over strategy, maybe, Kaedric reached for her hand, or maybe I'll discover that surviving isn't the same as living. And spending 20 more years alone in this fortress maintaining power I can't actually enjoy isn't worth the cost. Serafina was quiet for a moment, then laughed softly. "You know what's terrifying? I believe you. I believe that you'd actually sacrifice everything for this." She squeezed his hand. "And I can't decide if that makes you the bravest man I've met or the most foolish. Can it be both?" "Probably is." They stood together as the sun set over the northern territories, painting the mountains in shades of blood and gold. And Kaedric felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive kind that believed everything would work out, but the defiant kind that said, even if everything collapsed, even if the crown came for him, even if this decision destroyed his life, it was worth it. Because for the first time since his father died, Kaedric Ashmont had chosen something other than survival. He'd chosen connection over isolation, chosen risk over safety, chosen someone else's well-being over his own strategic advantage. And whether that made him a fool or something resembling human, he'd stopped caring about the distinction. Below them, Thornhaven Keep stood against the mountain like a wound that wouldn't heal, and somewhere in the capital, powerful men were sharpening knives they'd spent years waiting to use. But tonight, Kaedric wasn't alone. And for now, that was enough. The response from the capital arrived 4 weeks later in the form of a sealed letter bearing the king's personal mark. Kaedric opened it alone in his study while Gareth waited and Seraphina paced near the window. The letter was brief. Duke Ashmont, Lord Marcus Thorne has delivered his report regarding the Northern Territories and your management of Lady Seraphina Vale. The Crown finds your conduct with regard to the hostage to be inappropriate and damaging to the integrity of our political arrangements. You are hereby summoned to the capital to address these concerns before the Royal Council. Failure to appear within 30 days will be considered an act of treason. His Majesty expects your full cooperation. By order of the Crown. Kaedric read it twice, then set it down carefully. Gareth spoke first. They're calling you to account. Yes. If you go, they'll strip your titles, possibly imprison you. He moved closer to the desk. If you don't go, they'll send soldiers. Either way, you lose. Seraphina stopped pacing. This is my fault. No. Kaedric looked at her. This is politics. They've wanted to remove me for years. You're just the excuse they finally found. So what do you do? Seraphina's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. You can't fight the entire crown. Can't refuse a royal summons. Can't... Kaedric stood abruptly, and both Gareth and Seraphina fell silent. For 20 years he'd played by the crown's rules, had governed the territories they gave him, had enforced their laws, had maintained order through fear and discipline because that's what they needed from him. He'd been their attack dog, their monster, their convenient solution to problems that required brutality no one else wanted to acknowledge. And now they were going to discard him because he'd developed the humanity they spent years trying to suppress. No more. I'm not going to the capital, Kaedric said quietly. Gareth's eyes widened. That's treason. I know. They'll send armies. Let them. You can't hold Thornhaven against a siege. Seraphina's voice carried an edge of panic. They'll starve you out, kill everyone loyal to you, execute you for rebellion. Kaedric moved to the map covering his wall. The Northern Territories he'd governed for 2 decades. Mountains, forests, strategic positions that made invasion a nightmare. He'd spent years securing this region because the crown needed stability here. Now he was going to show them what instability looked like. I'm done being the crown's weapon, he said. Done ruling in their name while they treat me like a necessary embarrassment. If they want these territories, they can try to take them. But I won't hand them over quietly. Gareth stared at him. You're declaring independence. I'm declaring that my loyalty has limits. And they just found them. This is insane. Seraphina moved to his side. You can't fight the entire realm. Even with the North behind you, I don't need the entire North. Kaedric's voice was cold, calculating. I just need enough territory to make conquering it more expensive than tolerating my defiance. The king will send armies, but fighting a winter campaign in the mountains? Sustaining supply lines through hostile terrain? He looked at Gareth. How many men would the crown lose trying to take Thornhaven by force? Thousands. Gareth's voice was quiet. Maybe tens of thousands if you fortify the passes, but eventually I'll lose. Kaedric nodded. But not before I make them pay for every inch. Not before I turn the North into a bleeding wound that drains their resources and destabilizes their hold on the other territories. And maybe, just maybe, other regions will see that defiance is possible. You're starting a war. Seraphina's whisper carried horror and awe in equal measure. I'm refusing to be executed quietly. Kaedric turned to face her. They'll use you against me. Send assassins. Try to break me by threatening you. This gets worse before it gets better. I know. You should leave. Find somewhere safe. I'll arrange... No. Seraphina's voice was firm. You chose me over your safety. I'm choosing you over mine.
We burn together or we survive together. Those are the only options.
Kaedric looked at her, this woman who'd arrived broken and disposable, who'd somehow become the reason he was willing to risk everything, and felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, not regret. Certainty. Then we prepare for war, he said. And in that moment, standing in his study with a royal summons burning on his desk, and the woman he loved refusing to abandon him, Duke Kaedric Ashmont crossed the line every ruler fears. The point where survival stops being enough, where power becomes meaningless without purpose, where the monster finally decides what he's willing to die for. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the northern mountains, and somewhere in the capital, the king received word that his most dangerous subject had just refused to obey. The realm would bleed for this decision. But Kaedric Ashmont was done caring about the realm's comfort. He'd found something worth fighting for, and he would burn the entire kingdom to ash before surrendering it. War preparations consumed Thornhaven like fever. Within 48 hours of refusing the royal summons, Kaedric transformed the fortress from administrative center into siege fortress. Grain stores were inventoried and rationed. Weapons were distributed to every man capable of holding a blade. The mountain passes leading to Thornhaven were fortified with barriers designed to funnel attacking forces into killing zones where archers could massacre them from elevated positions. Gareth worked with brutal efficiency, drilling guards who'd grown soft during peacetime, teaching them how to kill instead of intimidate. Messengers were sent to the scattered villages throughout the northern territories, not demanding loyalty, but offering protection to those willing to stand against the crown. Surprisingly, many came. Farmers who remembered Kaedric's justice, merchants who'd prospered under his harsh but stable rule, veterans who'd fought beside him in the border wars and understood that sometimes defiance was the only honorable option. The North was rallying, not because they loved their duke, love was a luxury frontier territories couldn't afford, but because they feared the alternative. The crown would install some southern noble to govern the region, someone who'd never survived a northern winter, who'd implement policies designed for temperate climates and stable populations. Someone who'd get them all killed through incompetence disguised as civility. Better the monster they knew. Kaedric stood in the war chamber surrounded by maps marked with defensive positions and supply routes, feeling the weight of what he'd started settle across his shoulders like armor made of consequence. Every person who answered his call was now a traitor in the crown's eyes. Every village that sent men was signing its own execution warrant if Thornhaven fell. He'd made them all accomplices to his rebellion. The door opened and Seraphina entered carrying documents she'd been organizing, letters from noble houses throughout the north. Some offering support, others staying neutral, a few outright condemning his defiance. She'd thrown herself into the logistics of rebellion with the same cold efficiency she'd used to survive her father's political games. 3 houses have sent formal refusals, she said, setting the letters on the table. Lord Blackwood, Lady Crane, and Duke Mortimer. They're maintaining loyalty to the crown. Expected. Kaedric marked their territories on the map with black ink. Blackwood's lands border the capital territories. He can't afford to support rebellion. Lady Crane is too old to risk her house on a gamble. And Mortimer, he paused. Mortimer is smart enough to stay neutral until he sees which side wins. What about the others? Seraphina sorted through the remaining letters. House Sterling is sending 200 men. House Vale. She stopped, her expression flickering with something complicated. My uncle is sending supplies. Not soldiers, but food and weapons. Your uncle is risking his neck for you, for survival. My father's conspiracy already damaged our house. If you win, having supported you restores some credibility. If you lose, he can claim he was coerced. She met Kaedric's eyes. No one does anything for pure reasons. Everyone's calculating angles. Including you? Especially me. But at least I'm honest about it. Kaedric moved around the table and pulled her against him, feeling her heartbeat through the layers of wool and leather she wore. She'd stopped dressing like a noblewoman. Now she wore practical clothing designed for function. Dark colors, sturdy fabric, boots made for walking stone corridors instead of dancing in ballrooms. She looked like she belonged at Thornhaven, like she'd always belonged here. Are you afraid? Kaedric asked quietly. Seraphina was silent for a moment, then nodded against his chest. Terrified. Every moment. Because I know how this ends if we lose. They'll execute you publicly. Make an example. And me, she pulled back to look at him, they'll marry me off to someone loyal as punishment. Use me one last time before discarding whatever's left. That won't happen. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'll burn the entire capital before I let them take you. That's not comforting. It's honest.
Serafina smiled, sad, bitter, but real.
I know. That's why I believe you. They stood together in the war chamber surrounded by maps that charted their probable doom, and Kedrick felt the familiar calculus of command pressing against his skull. Every decision carried casualties. Every strategy required sacrifice. He'd spent 20 years accepting that arithmetic because the alternative was chaos. But now the variables included Serafina, and suddenly the math felt unbearable. The door burst open without warning. Gareth entered with an expression Kedrick recognized immediately. The look of a soldier who'd just discovered the battle was worse than anticipated. "We have a problem," Gareth said. The problem had a name: Lord Cassian Thorne, Marcus Thorne's older brother, a decorated general who'd led the Crown's armies through 3 major campaigns, a tactical genius who understood siege warfare better than any commander in the realm. And according to the intelligence Gareth had just received, the man personally leading the royal forces marching north to crush Kedrick's rebellion. The Crown wasn't sending a token force to intimidate. They were sending their best commander with orders to make Thornhaven a lesson written in blood and ash. "How many men?" Kedrick asked, studying the report Gareth had brought. 5,000. Infantry, cavalry, siege equipment. They're moving fast, bypassing the villages, heading straight for Thornhaven. Gareth pointed at the map. They'll reach the outer territories in 10 days. Be at our gates in 15. 15 days to prepare for a siege against an army that outnumbered them 5-1, led by a commander who'd never lost a campaign. The arithmetic was brutal. "Can we hold?" Serafina's voice was steady, but Kedrick heard the fear underneath. Gareth looked at Kedrick, waiting for permission to tell the truth. Kedrick nodded. "She deserves honesty." "In a straight fight?" "No." Gareth's voice was flat. "Cassian Thorne doesn't lose sieges. He's patient, methodical. He'll surround Thornhaven, cut supply lines, and wait for starvation to do his work. We can make it expensive, kill hundreds, maybe thousands before they breach the walls. But eventually, we'll break." "How long?" 3 months if we're lucky. 6 weeks if he's aggressive. Serafina absorbed that, her face pale but controlled. "Then we need something other than a straight fight." "Agreed." Kedrick turned to Gareth. "What are our options?" "Guerrilla tactics. Hit their supply lines before they reach us. Ambush their forward scouts. Make the journey north so bloody they reconsider the cost." Gareth traced routes on the map. "We know this terrain. They don't. Winter is coming. If we can delay them until the mountain passes freeze, they'll adapt. Cassian Thorne has fought winter campaigns before. He'll plan for it. Then we need allies." Gareth looked at Serafina. "More houses willing to commit soldiers. If we can field even 2,000 men. Most houses are staying neutral. They're waiting to see who wins before committing." Serafina's voice carried the bitterness of experience. "We're not going to rally more support until we prove we can actually resist." The room fell silent. Kedrick stared at the map, calculating angles and odds with the same ruthless pragmatism he'd used for 2 decades. Every scenario ended the same way. Thornhaven surrounded, supplies exhausted, walls breached, everyone inside killed or captured, unless he changed the equation. "There's another option," Kedrick said quietly. Both Gareth and Serafina looked at him. "I go to the capital. Alone, face the royal council." He met Serafina's eyes. "If they execute me, the rebellion ends. The North remains stable. Everyone who supported me can claim they were following orders. The Crown gets its blood without needing to destroy half the territory getting it. Absolutely not." Serafina's voice was sharp. "That's surrender disguised as sacrifice. It's strategy. If I remove myself, they'll still come after me. After everyone who supported you. The Crown doesn't forgive rebellion just because the leader dies." Serafina moved closer. "You taught me that. Mercy invites weakness. The moment you're gone, they'll purge the North to ensure this never happens again." She was right. Kedrick knew it. But the alternative was watching thousands die defending his pride. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked. "We fight." Serafina's jaw was set. "We make them bleed for every inch. We show the realm that defying the Crown is possible. Even if we lose, Even if they kill us all, we prove that resistance isn't futile. That's idealism, not strategy. Maybe. But idealism is what turns defeats into legends, and legends inspire future rebellions. She held his gaze. You said you were done being their weapon. Prove it. Show them that the monster they created can't be controlled anymore. Kedrick looked at Gareth, who shrugged. She's not wrong. If you surrender, you die alone and nothing changes. If you fight, you might die anyway, but at least you'll force them to pay for it. And who knows? Gareth's expression was grim. Maybe we get lucky. Luck wasn't strategy, but neither was suicide. Kedrick returned his attention to the map, calculating defensive positions and acceptable casualties, and felt the familiar weight of command settle across his shoulders. Prepare for siege, he said. Reinforce the walls, double the watch, send scouts to monitor Cassian's advance. If we're going to make this expensive, we need intelligence. Gareth nodded and left to implement orders. Serafina remained, studying Kedrick with an expression that mixed concern and determination. You think we're going to lose, she said, not a question. I think we're outnumbered, outmatched, and facing the best commander the crown has. Kedrick turned to face her. But I've survived worse odds by refusing to accept defeat as inevitable. So, yes, I think we'll probably lose, but I'm going to make them earn it. That's the most pessimistic battle cry I've ever heard. It's honest. Serafina moved into his arms, and they stood together in the war chamber while outside Thornhaven's walls, death marched closer with every passing hour. I love you, she whispered against his chest. The words landed like artillery. Kedrick had spent 20 years avoiding emotional entanglements because attachment was vulnerability. Because the moment you admitted caring, you gave your enemies ammunition. Because love was just another word for weakness in a world where power was the only currency that mattered. But standing there with Serafina in his arms, knowing they were both probably going to die defending a doomed rebellion, Kedrick realized that all his carefully constructed logic was just elaborate cowardice. He'd been afraid to feel anything because feeling meant losing control, and losing control meant becoming human. I love you too, he said quietly. Serafina pulled back to look at him, and tears were streaming down her face. Not from sadness, but from relief. Like she'd been waiting to hear those words and had stopped believing they'd come. They kissed with the desperation of people who just realized they'd wasted time being careful when they should have been reckless. Outside, the wind carried the first hints of winter, and somewhere in the distance, an army marched north with orders to destroy everything Kedrick had built. But for this moment, none of that mattered. For this moment, they were just two people who'd found each other in darkness and decided that was worth dying for. The betrayal came on the 7th night. Kedrick was in the armory inspecting weapons when the alarm bells started ringing, not the pattern for external attack, but the sharp staccato that meant internal breach. Someone inside the fortress had done something catastrophic. He ran toward the central keep, sword already drawn, and found chaos erupting in the main courtyard. Fire. Everywhere. The grain storage was burning, flames shooting 30 feet into the night sky, consuming months of carefully rationed supplies in a conflagration that could be seen for miles. Guards were scrambling with water buckets, but the fire had spread too fast. Someone had used accelerant. This wasn't accident. This was sabotage. Gareth appeared through the smoke, face blackened with ash, and grabbed Kedrick's arm. It's worse, he shouted over the roar of flames. The armory is compromised. Half our crossbows are missing. And the prisoners. What prisoners? The scouts we captured last week. The ones we were holding for intelligence. Gareth's expression was grim. Someone released them. They're gone. Kedrick felt ice slide down his spine. The scouts worked for Cassian Thorn. They'd been captured during reconnaissance, and Kedrick had kept them alive to extract information about the approaching army's strength and strategy. Now they were free, with intelligence about Thornhaven's defenses, its troop strength, its weaknesses, and someone inside the fortress had let them go. Who was on guard duty? Kedrick demanded. Gareth hesitated, and that hesitation told Kedrick everything he needed to know before the words came out. Captain Aldrich. The name hit like a blade between ribs. Aldrich, one of Kedrick's oldest officers, a man who'd fought beside him for 15 years, who'd earned scars defending Thornhaven, who'd been promoted based on loyalty and competence. Aldrich was a traitor. Where is he? Kedrick's voice was flat. Lethal. Gone. Disappeared right after the fire started. Gareth pointed toward the southern wall. But he left something. They moved through smoke and chaos to Aldrich's chambers, where a single letter lay on the otherwise empty desk. Kedrick recognized the handwriting before he opened it. Duke Ashmont. By the time you read of this, I'll be gone. I want you to understand this wasn't personal. I respect what you've built here, respect your strength, but I have a family in the capital, 2 daughters, a wife. And Lord Cassian made it very clear what happens to traitors' families if I don't cooperate. The scouts are freed, your grain stores destroyed, your weapons compromised. Cassian knows your strength now, knows your defenses. He'll be here in 5 days instead of 10 because I told him which routes are undefended. I'm sorry, but my daughters' lives matter more than your rebellion. Captain Aldrich Kedrick read the letter twice, feeling something cold and murderous settle in his chest. Aldrich hadn't betrayed him for money or power. He'd done it to protect his family. And Cassian Thorne had exploited that weakness with surgical precision, found the one man inside Thornhaven who had something more important than loyalty, and threatened it until the man broke. It was exactly what Kedrick would have done in Cassian's position. That didn't make it hurt less. How bad is the damage? Kedrick asked, keeping his voice level. Gareth's expression was grim. Grain stores are half gone. We'll be on strict rationing, and we won't last 3 months anymore. 6 weeks maximum before starvation becomes a problem. The weapons, he gestured helplessly. We can compensate, but we're weaker. And Cassian knows it. And morale? The men know someone betrayed us from inside. They're scared, questioning who else might turn. He paused. Some are already talking about surrender. Kedrick stood in Aldrich's empty chambers, reading a letter written by a man who'd chosen family over loyalty and felt the rebellion fracturing around him. This was the cost of defiance. Not just external enemies, but internal collapse. Because people weren't chess pieces. They had families, fears, pressure points that skilled commanders could exploit. And Cassian Thorne was very skilled. He turned one of Kedrick's most trusted men into a weapon aimed at Thornhaven's heart. Find Aldrich, Kedrick said quietly. I want him brought back alive. Gareth stared at him. He's probably halfway to Cassian's camp by now. I don't care. Send riders. Track him. Bring him back. And when we do, we'll discuss his punishment then. Gareth left, and Kedrick remained alone in the traitor's chambers, surrounded by the ghost of loyalty that had crumbled under pressure. The door opened and Seraphina entered, face pale, eyes wide. I heard what happened, she said. Aldrich betrayed us. I know. She moved closer. The men are panicking. They're saying if Aldrich could turn, anyone could. She stopped, searching for words. They're losing faith. Kedrick looked at her, and in her expression he saw the same fear he felt gnawing at his own certainty. Not fear of death, fear of being wrong, of having made a choice that destroyed everyone who trusted him. Maybe they should lose faith, he said quietly. Maybe I've led them into a massacre based on pride instead of strategy. Stop it! Seraphina's voice was sharp. You chose defiance because the alternative was execution. You didn't force anyone to follow. They came because they believed you were worth fighting for. And now they're going to die because I couldn't protect them from internal sabotage. You're not omniscient. You can't control everything. Seraphina grabbed his shoulders. Aldrich made his choice. He valued his family over his oath. That's human. Understandable. But it doesn't make your rebellion wrong, doesn't it? Kedrick pulled away. I stood in that war chamber and told people we could resist, that defiance was possible. I made them believe in something that's collapsing around us. The supplies are gone, the weapons compromised. The enemy commander knows our weaknesses, and our own men are ready to surrender. Then give them a reason not to. What reason? Hope? Strategy? Kedrick's voice was bitter. We're outnumbered, outmatched, betrayed from within. What am I supposed to tell them that isn't a lie? Tell them the truth. Seraphina's eyes were fierce. That even if we lose, even if Cassian slaughters every person in this fortress, we proved that the crown's power has limits. That monsters can choose something other than obedience. That some things are worth dying for. Kedrick stared at her, and in that moment realized that Seraphina was stronger than he'd ever been. She'd survived betrayal her entire life and still believed resistance mattered. Still chose hope when logic demanded surrender. He'd spent 20 years ruling through fear and isolation because it was safe. She'd spent 20 years being destroyed by powerful men and still refused to break. Who was really the brave one?
I don't know how to do this, Kadric admitted quietly. How to lead people into probable death and make it mean something. You do it the same way you've led them for 20 years. Seraphina's voice was steady, with honesty, with strength. By being the man they chose to follow, even when following you means dying. And if I fail, then you fail trying. That's more honor than most men ever earn. Kadric pulled her against him, and they stood together in the traitor's chambers while outside Thornhaven burned, and an army marched closer with intelligence that made resistance nearly impossible. He'd made so many mistakes, refused the royal summons, started a rebellion he couldn't win, trusted a man who'd been coerced into betrayal, put everyone who followed him in danger because he'd valued pride over pragmatism. But standing there with Seraphina, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, Kadric realized something that changed the equation. He'd spent 20 years measuring success by survival. Now he was learning that survival without meaning was just slow death. Maybe they'd lose. Probably they'd lose. But they'd lose fighting for something real instead of living as tools for people who saw them as expendable. That had to count for something. Come on, Kadric said, pulling back. We have work to do. What work? Proving that betrayal didn't break us. Seraphina looked skeptical, and Kadric smiled grimly. Cassian thinks one traitor destroyed our resistance. Let's show him he's wrong. They left Aldrich's chambers and walked into the burning courtyard where guards fought flames and soldiers questioned their loyalty, and the rebellion teetered on collapse. Kadric raised his voice. Listen to me. The activity slowed. Guards stopped mid-motion. Soldiers turned to face their duke, covered in ash and exhaustion, standing in the ruins of what should have been their salvation. Captain Aldrich betrayed us. Kadric's voice carried across the courtyard. He freed enemy scouts, destroyed our supplies, compromised our defenses. He did it to save his family, and Lord Cassian Thorne used that love as a weapon against us. Silence. Some of you are wondering if surrender is the smarter choice, if loyalty to me is worth dying for, if this rebellion is doomed. Kadric met their eyes, one by one. You're right to question, because I can't promise victory. Can't promise survival. Can't even promise that everyone who fights beside me will see tomorrow. He paused, letting the words settle. But I can promise this. If we surrender now, the crown wins without bloodshed. They'll execute me quietly, scatter you to different regions, install a new duke who'll govern with the same brutality, but without the competence. And 20 years from now, when the next crisis comes, you'll remember that you had a chance to resist and chose comfort instead. The courtyard remained silent, but Kadric saw the shift in their expressions. The calculation changing from fear to something else. Or we fight. We make Cassian Thorne pay for every inch. We show the realm that the North doesn't kneel easily. And even if we lose, even if they burn Thornhaven to the ground, we'll have proven that some things matter more than survival. Kadric's voice dropped, but it carried. I won't order you to stay. Won't force loyalty. If you want to leave, the gates are open. But if you choose to fight, know that you're fighting for the idea that power has limits, that monsters can choose humanity, that defiance, even doomed defiance, still matters. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a young guard, barely 20, face blackened with ash, stepped forward. I'll stay. Another soldier joined him, then another. Within minutes, the entire courtyard was filled with men and women who'd chosen resistance over safety. Not because Kadric had promised victory, because he'd told them the truth. And sometimes truth was stronger than hope. But Aldrich was captured 3 days later, dragged back to Thornhaven by riders who'd tracked him through mountain passes he'd thought would hide his escape. Kadric met him in the dungeons beneath the keep, where stone walls wept with moisture and torches cast shadows that looked like demons waiting for judgment. Aldrich knelt in chains, face bruised from capture, eyes filled with shame and defiance in equal measure. My daughters, he said before Kadric could speak, are they safe? Kadric studied the man who'd betrayed him, saw not a monster but a father who'd made an impossible choice. I don't know, Kadric said quietly. Cassian promised you protection if you cooperated. Whether he keeps that promise depends on whether he's honorable. He's not. Aldrich's voice was hollow. I knew that when I made the deal, but I had to try. You understand that, don't you? You'd do the same for Lady Seraphina. The comparison landed like accusation because it was true.
Caedric would burn the realm to save Seraphina, had already started the fire, so judging Aldrich for doing the same thing felt hypocritical. But hypocrisy was a luxury commanders couldn't afford. "You betrayed everyone in this fortress," Caedric said. "Destroyed supplies that would have kept us alive. Freed enemy scouts who'll use their intelligence to kill your fellow soldiers. You chose your family over everyone else's." "I did." Aldrich met his eyes. "And I'd do it again. Because my daughters matter more than your rebellion, more than the North, more than everything." He leaned forward despite the chains. "You can execute me, should execute me, but don't pretend you wouldn't make the same choice." Caedric stood in the dungeon, looking at a man whose crime was loving too much in a situation where love was liability, and felt the familiar weight of command pressing down. Every decision carried casualties. Every choice required sacrifice. He could execute Aldrich and send a message that betrayal meant death, that loyalty was absolute, that personal concerns didn't excuse treason. Or he could show mercy and prove that understanding human weakness didn't equal accepting it. Both choices had consequences. Both would be judged. "You're right," Caedric finally said. "I would make the same choice. But that doesn't change what happens next." He turned to the guards flanking the cell. "Execution at dawn. Public. In the courtyard where everyone can see the cost of betrayal." Aldrich's expression didn't change. He'd expected this. "Make it quick," he said quietly. "I will." Caedric left the dungeons and climbed back toward the fortress proper, feeling the weight of mercy he couldn't afford settling across his shoulders like a cloak made of consequence. Aldrich had loved his family more than his oath. Caedric loved Seraphina more than his rebellion. The only difference was that Caedric had the power to act on his love without pretending it was noble, and the honesty of that hypocrisy was more terrifying than any enemy army. Dawn came cold and sharp. The execution took place in the main courtyard, where every person in Thornhaven gathered to watch justice delivered in the most permanent way possible. Aldrich knelt in the center, hands bound, expression resigned. He'd written letters to his daughters the night before, letters that would probably never reach them, but had to be written anyway. Caedric stood on the platform above, sword in hand, and looked at the man who'd betrayed him for love. He understood the choice, would have made the same one, but understanding didn't equal forgiveness. "Captain Aldrich," Caedric's voice carried across the silent courtyard, "you betrayed Thornhaven, betrayed the men who fought beside you, betrayed the trust placed in you through 15 years of service. The penalty is death." Aldrich nodded. "Make it quick." Caedric descended the platform and drew his sword, not the ceremonial blade nobles used for executions, but the working steel he'd carried for 20 years, the same sword that had killed raiders and traitors and enemies of every description. He positioned himself behind Aldrich and raised the blade. "Your daughters will know you loved them," Caedric said quietly. "Thank you." The sword fell, quick, clean, merciful in the only way execution could be. Aldrich's body collapsed forward, and the courtyard remained silent. No cheers, no condemnation, just the weight of necessity acknowledged by people who understood that loyalty and love sometimes required impossible choices. Caedric stood over the body, sword dripping, and felt nothing except the cold certainty that this was just the beginning. Cassian Thorne had found one weakness. He'd find others. And every person Caedric cared about was now a weapon aimed at his throat. Behind him, Seraphina stood watching, face pale but steady. And Caedric realized with terrible clarity that loving her had given his enemies exactly what they needed to destroy him. Not through force, but through the kind of surgical cruelty that turns strength into liability. Because monsters could be resisted, but men who loved could be broken. And Caedric Ashmont had just learned that becoming human made him more vulnerable than he'd ever been as a weapon. Cassian Thorne's army arrived on the 11th day like a plague written in steel and fire. Caedric watched from Thornhaven's highest tower as 5,000 men assembled in the valley below, their formations precise and methodical, siege equipment rolling into position with the efficiency of a machine designed to crush stone and spirit in equal measure. Trebuchets, battering rams, scaling towers that could reach Thornhaven's walls and vomit soldiers onto the battlements. Every piece of equipment represented months of planning and resources that dwarfed anything the North could muster. This wasn't an army sent to negotiate. This was extermination dressed in military discipline. Beside him, Gareth studied the enemy positions through a far-seeing glass, counting banners and calculating odds with the grim pragmatism of a soldier who'd fought enough losing battles to recognize one forming. 5,200, Gareth said quietly. Maybe more. He lowered the glass. Cassian brought his entire force. No reserves. No garrisons left behind. He's committing everything to this.
Because he knows we're the example, Kadric replied. The Crown can't afford to let rebellion look survivable. They need us destroyed so completely that no one else gets ideas. Below them, the army finished assembling. Banners snapped in the wind, the Crown's golden lion prominent among regional house sigils. At the center of the formation, a single tent larger than the others marked the command position. Cassian Thorne's headquarters. The man himself emerged moments later, and even from this distance, Kadric could see the resemblance to Marcus. Taller, broader, built like someone who'd spent decades in armor instead of political chambers. He moved through the camp with the confidence of a commander who'd never lost a siege, inspecting positions, issuing orders that rippled through his forces like current through water. Professional, competent, utterly certain of victory. Watching him, Kadric felt the familiar weight of command pressing against his skull. Every strategic calculation pointed toward the same conclusion. Thornhaven couldn't win through conventional defense. The walls were strong but not impregnable. The garrison numbered barely 1,000 after accounting for losses and desertion. Supplies, already compromised by Aldrich's sabotage, would last 6 weeks under strict rationing. 6 weeks against a commander who'd wait 6 months if necessary. The arithmetic was brutal and absolute. He's going to starve us, Gareth said, voicing what they both understood. Won't even waste men on direct assault. Just surround us, cut supply lines, and wait for hunger to do his work. Then we don't give him that option. Gareth looked at him sharply. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Cassian expects conventional siege defense, expects us to hunker behind walls and conserve resources while he methodically dismantles our position. Kadric turned from the window. What if we do the opposite? You want a sortie? Against 5,000 men? Gareth's voice carried disbelief. That's suicide. Staying behind walls is slower suicide. Kadric moved to the map table where their defensive positions were marked. Cassian's strength is patience and resources. He can afford to wait because he brought supplies for months. But his weakness is complacency. He's never faced an enemy desperate enough to attack when outnumbered 5 to 1. Because attacking when outnumbered 5 to 1 is insane. Exactly, which means he won't expect it. Kadric traced the valley on the map. Tonight, before his forces fully entrench. Before they build the siege lines. We hit their supply depot with everything we have. Burn their food stores. Destroy their equipment. Force them into a quick assault instead of patient starvation. Gareth stared at him. You're gambling our entire garrison on one night raid. I'm changing the equation. Kadric met his eyes. Right now, Cassian controls the timeline. He decides when to attack, when to wait, when to tighten the noose. If we burn his supplies, we force his hand, make him attack before he's ready, or retreat to resupply. Either way, we survive longer than 6 weeks. Or we die faster when the raid fails. That's possible. Probable, Gareth corrected. His camp will be guarded, defended, and even if we succeed in burning supplies, we'll lose half our garrison getting out. Half our garrison dies anyway when starvation sets in. At least this way they die fighting instead of starving behind walls. Gareth was silent, and Kadric knew he was calculating the same brutal arithmetic. Every choice carried casualties. Every strategy required sacrifice. The only question was whether dying quickly with purpose was better than dying slowly without hope. Finally, Gareth nodded. When? Tonight, before midnight. Assemble strike teams, light, fast, equipped for sabotage, not pitched battle. We move through the southern pass where his forces are weakest. Kadric pointed at the map. Hit the supply depot, burn everything, and retreat before they can organize pursuit. And if they catch us, they won't. Because Cassian thinks we're trapped and terrified. He's not expecting wolves. Gareth left to organize the raid, and Kadric remained alone in the tower, staring at the enemy army that had come to destroy everything he'd built. 20 years ago, he'd inherited these territories and turned them from chaos into order through ruthless discipline. Had ruled with fear because mercy got you killed in the north.
had become the monster the realm needed, even as they despised him for it. Now that monster was going to do what monsters did best: make the hunters remember why fear existed. Serafina found him an hour before the raid, in his chambers where armor waited to be donned and weapons lay ready for violence that would either save them or accelerate their destruction. "You're going yourself," she said. Not a question. Kadric looked up from sharpening his sword, the working blade that had killed dozens, scarred from use, reliable in the way only weapons forged in actual combat could be. "I am. Let Gareth lead. Let someone else risk—" "No." Kedrick set down the whetstone. "I'm asking men to die attacking an army 5 times their size. I won't order that from safety. If they're risking everything, I risk it with them. That's pride, not strategy. Maybe. But it's also leadership. Soldiers follow commanders who share their dangers." Kadric stood, moving to where his armor waited. "If I stay behind walls while they die raiding, I lose their respect, lose the loyalty that's keeping this garrison together." Serafina stepped closer, and her hands were shaking. "What if you don't come back?" Then Gareth assumes command. He knows the defensive positions, knows how to— "I don't care about defensive positions." Her voice cracked. "I care about you walking into a battle you might not survive because your pride won't let someone else lead." "It's not pride." Kedrick pulled her against him, feeling her heartbeat racing. "It's necessity. These men are dying for my rebellion, my choice to defy the crown. The least I can do is die beside them if it comes to that." "And what about me? What do I do if you die out there? You survive. Adapt. Become whatever you need to become to outlast this." Kaedric tilted her face up to meet his eyes. "You're stronger than you believe, stronger than I ever was. If I fall, you'll find a way through. That's not comforting. It's honest." Serafina pulled back, tears streaming down her face, and for a moment Kaedric saw not the sharp-edged survivor who'd refused to break, but the young woman who'd arrived at Thornhaven broken and disposable, looking for something worth surviving for. He'd given her that, and now he was risking it on a raid that would probably get him killed. But sitting behind walls waiting for starvation felt like surrender. And Kaedric had spent 20 years refusing to surrender even when logic demanded it. Some patterns were too ingrained to break. "I love you," Serafina whispered. "Come back to me." "I'll try." "Not good enough. Promise me." Kaedric wanted to promise, wanted to give her the certainty she needed. But 20 years of command had taught him that promises made to loved ones before battle were just elaborate lies designed to make parting easier. So he told her the truth. "I can't promise that. Can't control whether I survive. But I can promise that if I die, it'll be trying to protect what we've built here. Trying to prove that monsters can choose something other than power and isolation. That's still not comforting. No. But it's real." They kissed with the desperate intensity of people who knew this might be the last time, and when they finally broke apart, Serafina's expression had shifted from fear to something harder. Determination. "Then don't die," she said quietly, "because I'm not done with you yet. We're not done. And I refuse to let this story end with you bleeding out in some field because you are too stubborn to stay safe." Kedrick smiled despite everything. "Yes, my lady. And when you come back, because you will come back, we're having a conversation about your definition of strategic risk. Looking forward to it." She left before her composure cracked completely, and Kadric was alone with his armor and weapons and the certainty that he was walking into a battle that would either change everything or end it. Either way, the waiting was over. They moved through darkness like smoke-given teeth. 300 men, the fastest, most experienced fighters in Thornhaven's garrison, slipped through the southern pass under moonless sky, moving in silence that came from years of living in hostile territory where noise meant death. No armor that would clank, no weapons that would reflect light, just blackened steel, dark clothing, and the grim certainty that they were about to attack an army that outnumbered them 17-1. Kaedric led from the front because that's what commanders did when asking the impossible. Gareth moved beside him, both of them navigating terrain they'd scouted during preparation, counting steps and using landmarks invisible in darkness, but memorized during daylight reconnaissance. Behind them, strike teams followed in precise formation, 50 men assigned to the supply depot, another 50 to siege equipment, the remainder positioned as rearguard to cover retreat. It was a plan that required perfect execution and luck they probably didn't have. But waiting for luck had never been Kaedric's strength. The enemy camp appeared through darkness like a constellation of torches and cooking fires. Massive, sprawling. 5,000 men settled in for siege, confident in their numbers and position. Guards patrolled the perimeter, but their attention was focused outward, watching for threats from the mountains, not expecting enemies to emerge from terrain they'd secured hours ago. Cassian's first mistake. He'd assumed Kaedric would defend conventionally. Kaedric held up a fist, signaling halt. The strike force froze, 300 men becoming statues in darkness 50 yards from the nearest enemy patrol. Close enough to smell cooking meat and hear conversations carried on night wind. Close enough to see individual faces of men who'd come north to crush rebellion. Close enough to kill them all if this went wrong. Kaedric waited, counting heartbeats, watching patrol patterns, calculating the narrow window between guard rotations when the camp's defensive perimeter would be weakest. He'd spent 20 years studying violence, understanding it, becoming fluent in the language of death until he could read battles the way scholars read ancient texts. This battle was writing itself in real time, and the current sentence said, "Now." Kaedric gave the signal. 300 men moved as one. Silent. Fast. Lethal. The first guards died without understanding what happened. Throats cut, bodies lowered quietly to avoid noise that would trigger alarm. Strike teams split according to plan, flowing through the camp like poison through veins, heading toward targets marked during daylight observation. Kaedric led 50 men toward the supply depot, a collection of wagons and tents near the camp's center where food stores and equipment were staged, unguarded except for 2 sentries who died before they could shout warning. Inside the depot, months of supplies waited: grain, salted meat, barrels of water. Everything Cassian needed to sustain a siege that would last until winter. Kaedric pulled out the accelerant they'd prepared, oil-soaked rags wrapped around pitch that would burn hot enough to consume everything. "Do it," he said quietly. 50 men moved through the depot, lighting fires that caught and spread with terrifying speed. Within seconds, flames roared toward the sky, consuming supplies and sending smoke billowing across the camp. That's when the screaming started. Soldiers erupted from tents, half-dressed and confused, reaching for weapons while trying to understand what was happening. Officers shouted orders that got lost in chaos. Bucket brigades formed instinctively but uselessly. The fire had already consumed too much to be stopped. And through the chaos, Kaedric's strike teams continued their work. Another team hit the siege equipment, setting trebuchets and battering rams ablaze, destroying months of preparation in minutes, turning Cassian's patient siege strategy into ash and confusion. It was working. Better than Kaedric had hoped, which meant it was about to get worse, because plans survived until contact with reality, and reality was about to punch back. Sets. The counterattack came from the eastern perimeter where Cassian had positioned his best troops. Not conscripts, not garrison soldiers. Elite cavalry trained for rapid response, men who'd fought in a dozen campaigns and knew how to transition from sleep to combat in seconds. They hit Kaedric's rearguard like a hammer striking glass. Steel flashed in firelight. Men screamed. The careful discipline of the raid fractured into close-quarters savagery where training mattered less than desperation. Kaedric heard the fighting shift before he saw it, the sound changing from controlled violence to chaos, the distinctive noise of a defensive line breaking under pressure it couldn't withstand. "Fall back," he shouted. "Strike teams, disengage and retreat." But retreat under pressure was the hardest maneuver in combat, required discipline when instincts screamed to run, required soldiers to maintain formation while enemies tried to kill them from behind. Half of Kaedric's rearguard died in the first minute. The rest fought their way backward through a camp now fully alert and mobilizing. Every second brought more enemy soldiers into the fight. Every step toward the southern pass became contested ground purchased with blood. Kaedric found himself in the center of it, sword moving through patterns drilled into muscle memory, killing with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this since he was 16. A soldier lunged at him, young, terrified, just doing his job, and Kaedric killed him without hesitation. Then another. Then another. This was the truth of combat that nobles never understood. It wasn't glorious, wasn't honorable. It was just bodies hitting ground and trying not to be one of them. Beside him, Gareth fought with brutal effectiveness, protecting Kaedric's flank while shouting orders that kept what remained of their formation from completely dissolving. "Keep moving!" Gareth's voice carried over the chaos. "Don't stop! Don't engage unless necessary!" But necessary kept expanding because enemy soldiers were everywhere now, pouring from tents, forming attack groups, cutting off escape routes with the discipline of troops who'd trained for exactly this scenario. Cassian had anticipated the raid. Not the timing, not the specific target, but he'd prepared for the possibility of desperate action, and now his preparations were killing Kaedric's men with mechanical efficiency. Kaedric saw the calculation shift in real time. They weren't going to make it back to the southern pass. Too many enemies. Too much distance. The strike force was going to be surrounded and slaughtered in a camp they'd been idiotic enough to attack. He'd gambled everything on changing the equation, and the equation had just eaten him alive. "We're cut off," Gareth shouted, confirming what Kaedric already knew. "Southern pass is blocked. At least 200 hostiles between us and escape. Then we make a new path." Kaedric pointed toward the western perimeter where the camp bordered forest. "Break through there. Use the trees for cover. That's away from Thornhaven. We'll be isolated in hostile territory. We're dead if we stay here. Move!" What remained of the strike force, maybe 200 men, less than started, bleeding and exhausted, pivoted toward the western perimeter where guards were forming defensive positions. This was going to be ugly. Kaedric charged the line with 50 men behind him, hitting the hastily formed defenders with the full force of soldiers who knew they were dead if they didn't break through. Steel met steel. Bodies collided. Men screamed and died in the narrow space between survival and extermination. Kaedric's sword shattered someone's collarbone, turned, caught another soldier across the face, pivoted into a thrust that punched through leather armor and into something soft that made the enemy combatant drop like a puppet with cut strings. Mechanical, efficient, horrible. This was what he'd become after 20 years of violence. Not a man, a weapon that occasionally remembered being human. The defensive line broke. Kaedric's force punched through into forest beyond the camp, leaving bodies and chaos behind, running through darkness with enemy soldiers in pursuit and no clear path back to Thornhaven. They'd succeeded in burning Cassian's supplies. They'd also succeeded in isolating themselves in hostile territory with an army hunting them. Strategic victory. Tactical disaster. Kaedric kept moving, leading survivors deeper into forest, putting distance between them and immediate pursuit, knowing that somewhere behind them, Cassian Thorn was organizing hunting parties that would track them through. These woods with the patience of a man who'd won sieges by refusing to give enemies any path to survival. "We need to circle back to Thornhaven," Gareth said, breathing hard, face covered in blood that might be his or someone else's. "If we're caught out here, I know." Kaedric stopped, letting his men catch up. They were scattered, exhausted, some wounded, all terrified. He could see it in their eyes. The realization that their Duke's desperate gambit had gotten them trapped behind enemy lines. But he could also see something else. Pride. They'd attacked an army 5 times their size and burned months of supplies. Had proven that Thornhaven wasn't just going to starve quietly. Had forced Cassian Thorn to react instead of dictate terms. They'd change the equation even if it killed them. "Listen to me," Kaedric said quietly, his voice carrying to the men gathered around him. "We're cut off from Thornhaven. Enemy forces are hunting us. Our odds of survival just got worse." Someone laughed, bitter, exhausted. "But we did what we came to do. Burned their supplies, destroyed their siege equipment, forced them into a position where patient starvation isn't an option anymore." Kaedric met their eyes. Cassian Thorn came north expecting an easy siege. "We just showed him there's nothing easy about the north." More laughter now, grim but real. "We circle back to Thornhaven through the eastern ridge. It's longer, harder, but it keeps us in terrain where small numbers are advantage instead of liability." Kaedric raised his sword. "And if they catch us before we reach home, we make them earn every inch. Understood?" "Understood." The response came ragged but unified. "Then move." They disappeared into darkness. 200 men who just reminded the Crown's best commander that the North didn't break easily. And behind them, Cassian Thorn's army scrambled to recover from chaos that should have been impossible. Quiet. Dawn found them 3 miles from Thornhaven, moving through mountain passes that turned cavalry advantage into liability. Behind them, pursuit had intensified. Cassian had sent tracker teams and light infantry, soldiers who knew how to move through rough terrain, who could match Kaedric's pace and pressure his formation. Not enough to overwhelm, just enough to keep them running. Keep them exhausted. Keep them from stopping long enough to rest. Attrition warfare. Cassian couldn't afford to let them reach Thornhaven, couldn't allow the raid to be seen as successful. So he was spending men hunting down survivors to prove that desperate action only accelerated destruction. Another soldier fell, arrow through his leg from pursuers they couldn't see but knew were there. "Leave him," Kadric ordered. "My lord, we can't carry wounded and maintain pace. Leave him." The look in his men's eyes was pure betrayal, but Kadric ignored it. Command meant making choices no one else wanted to make. Meant accepting that saving everyone was impossible when survival depended on speed. The wounded soldier would be captured, probably executed. But better one man than 200. That was the arithmetic of combat. Brutal, necessary, unforgivable. They kept moving, leaving bodies behind, and Kadric felt each abandonment like a blade between ribs, but didn't let it show because command required projecting certainty even when drowning in doubt. Thornhaven's walls appeared through morning mist. Home. Safety. Just 2 miles across open ground where Cassian's forces could see them and bring cavalry to bear. This was the moment. The final sprint where they either made it back or died within sight of salvation. Kadric looked at his surviving men, maybe 150 now, battered and bleeding, pushed beyond limits most soldiers never faced, and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, not confidence, pride. These men had followed him into insanity and survived, had proven that Thornhaven's garrison wasn't just going to accept defeat, had changed the equation in ways Cassian would spend days calculating. "Run," Kadric said simply. They ran, across open ground, through morning light, with enemy cavalry appearing behind them like demons summoned from nightmare, thundering across the distance with lances ready and death in their eyes. Thornhaven's gates opened. Archers appeared on the walls, raining arrows toward pursuing cavalry, buying seconds that meant everything. Kadric's force sprinted through gates that slammed shut behind them, and suddenly he was back inside walls he'd left expecting never to see again. They'd made it. Barely. Bloodied. Reduced by half. But they'd made it. Gareth collapsed against the gate, breathing hard, face a mask of exhaustion and relief. That was insane. Yes, we lost half our strike force. I know. Was it worth it? Kadric looked toward the tower where Seraphina would be watching, where he'd stood yesterday calculating impossible odds and choosing action over acceptance. "Ask me in a week," he said, "when we see how Cassian responds to having his siege strategy burned to ash." The response came that afternoon. Cassian Thorn himself approached Thornhaven's gates under flag of parley, flanked by 2 guards, his armor pristine despite the chaos of the previous night. Kadric met him on the walls, standing where the entire garrison could see both commanders facing each other across the divide between rebellion and authority. Cassian looked up with an expression that mixed respect and contempt in equal measure. "Duke Ashmont." His voice carried easily across the distance. That was impressive. Reckless. Suicidal. But impressive. "Lord Thorn." Kadric kept his voice level. "I assume you're here to discuss terms. I'm here to offer you a final chance at surrender." Cassian's tone was conversational. "You burned my supplies, destroyed siege equipment, killed 40 of my men. In return, you lost half your strike force and confirmed you're desperate enough to attack when outnumbered 5-1. He smiled. "That desperation is going to get everyone in this fortress killed. Maybe, not maybe. Certainty." Cassian gestured toward his camp where soldiers were reorganizing, building new siege lines, preparing for assault instead of patient starvation. "You wanted to change the equation. You succeeded. But the new equation is worse. I'm no longer waiting for starvation. I'm attacking in 3 days, full assault. And when I breach those walls, when I will breach those walls, everyone inside dies." He paused, except Lady Seraphina Vale. Kadric felt ice slide down his spine. "Lady Vale will be returned to the capital alive," Cassian continued. "Married to a suitable noble, her bloodline preserved. That's mercy I'm offering despite her involvement in your rebellion." He met Kadric's eyes. "But only if you surrender now. Walk out of those gates, kneel before the crown's authority, and I'll ensure she survives what's coming." The offer landed like artillery. Surrender and Seraphina lives,
Fight, and she dies when the walls fall.
It was the same tactic Cassian had used on Aldrich. Find the weakness, apply pressure, force impossible choices. Kaedric looked down at the commander who'd spent a career winning through ruthless competence and felt something cold and murderous settle in his chest. Tell the crown. I have a counteroffer, Kedrick said quietly. Cassian raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. When you assault these walls, you'll lose thousands, maybe half your army before you breach the gates. Because every man, woman, and child inside Thornhaven knows what happens if they surrender. They know the crown executes rebels as examples. He leaned forward. So they're going to fight like people with nothing to lose. And that kind of desperation, Kedrick smiled without humor, is worth 10 times your numbers. You're bluffing. Am I? Test me. Bring your army. Breach these walls. And discover exactly how expensive mercy becomes when you're fighting people who've stopped caring about survival. Cassian stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition. The look of one professional acknowledging another. You're going to lose, Cassian said quietly.
You know that. Probably.
But you're going to bleed for it. And when this is over, when you return to the capital with a quarter of your army dead, the king is going to ask if crushing one northern duke was worth the cost. Kaedric's voice was flat. Make your choice, Lord Thorn. Walk away and live. Or attack and discover why the north has never been conquered easily. Cassian turned without responding, walking back to his camp with his guards, and Kaedric watched him go, knowing that he'd just made the situation irrevocably worse. Cassian would attack in 3 days. And when those walls fell, because they would fall, everyone Kaedric cared about would die. Behind him, footsteps approached. Seraphina. He heard what Cassian offered, she said quietly. You were listening. Everyone was listening. She moved to stand beside him, looking out over the enemy army preparing for assault. He offered me life if you surrender. He did. Are you considering it? Kedrick looked at her. This woman who'd arrived broken and had become the reason he'd started a rebellion he couldn't win, and felt something break inside his chest. Not certainty. Not strategy. Just the simple truth that loving her had destroyed every calculation he'd spent 20 years perfecting. No, he said. I'm not considering it. Why not? Seraphina's voice was shaking. If you surrender, you die, but I survive. That's something. That's more than we'll have if you fight. You'll survive as property, married to some noble who will use you for bloodline and political advantage, living the same life your father condemned you to. Kedrick turned to face her fully. I won't trade your freedom for your survival. Won't send you back to becoming someone's tool after you finally escaped. Then we die together. Probably. That's not romantic. That's wasteful. Maybe. Kedrick pulled her against him. But at least we die human. Die choosing. Die meaning something instead of surviving as weapons for people who see us as expendable. Seraphina was crying now, and Kaedric held her while below them, 5,000 men prepared to assault walls that couldn't hold and kill everyone inside who dared believe defiance was possible. 3 days. That's how long they had before everything ended. 3 days to prove that monsters could choose humanity even when it killed them. 3 days before the Crown's best commander turned Thornhaven into a lesson written in blood. And standing on the walls holding the woman he loved, Kedrick Ashmont realized that he'd finally found something worth dying for. The only question was whether dying for it would change anything, or if resistance was just another form of surrender disguised as choice. The answer would come in 3 days. When the walls fell, and the realm discovered what happened when you pushed the North's monster too far. The final 3 days passed like watching an execution clock count down in a language everyone understood but no one wanted to translate. Kedrick spent the hours preparing Thornhaven for assault that would come whether they were ready or not. Every able body was armed and positioned. Every weak point in the walls was reinforced with whatever materials remained. The wounded who could still fight were given weapons and assigned to secondary defensive positions. Even the servants, cooks, stable hands, people who'd spent their lives avoiding violence, were taught how to hold a blade and where to strike when enemies breached the gates, because the gates would be breached. Cassian Thorn didn't lose sieges, and desperation wasn't strategy, no matter how much Kaedric wanted to believe otherwise. The arithmetic remained brutal and absolute. 5,000 attackers against maybe 800 defenders. Walls that could slow but not stop a determined assault. Supplies damaged by sabotage. No reinforcements coming, no relief force marching to their salvation. They were going to lose.
The only question was how many they'd take down first. On the second night, Gareth found Caedric on the battlements staring at Cassian's camp where fires burned like stars fallen to earth,
Each one representing soldiers who'd come north to crush rebellion, and probably would. "You should sleep," Gareth said without conviction. "Can't. Every time I close my eyes, I calculate casualties." Caedric didn't look away from the enemy camp. See their formations. Count how many of our people die in the first wave versus the second. It's exhausting. That's command. The privilege of knowing exactly how badly things will go wrong before they happen. They stood in silence for a moment. Two men who'd fought together for 15 years, who'd survived battles that should have killed them, who were about to face the fight that finally would.
"I'm sorry," Caedric said quietly. Gareth looked at him sharply. "For what?"
"For getting you killed. For starting a rebellion I couldn't win. For believing that defiance mattered more than survival." Caedric finally turned to face him. "You could have left. Could have refused to follow me into this. You stayed anyway." "Of course I stayed." Gareth's voice carried no resentment. "I followed you for 15 years through every miserable decision the North forced on us. Why would I stop now just because the decision is suicidal?" "Because it is suicidal. Maybe. But it's also the first time I've seen you choose something other than survival. Choose someone other than yourself." Gareth gestured toward where Seraphina was visible in the tower, organizing supplies with the same cold efficiency she'd used to survive her father's political games. "You spent 20 years being the realm's weapon, the crown's monster. Finally, you decided to be human. If that gets us killed," he shrugged, "at least we die knowing you were worth following." The words landed harder than they should have because they were true. Caedric had spent 2 decades pushing people away, refusing emotional attachment, ruling through fear because connection was vulnerability. He'd become exactly what the realm needed him to be: efficient, brutal, alone. And it had kept him alive but hollow. Seraphina had changed that, had refused to flinch, had looked at the monster everyone feared and seen someone worth saving. And saving her, choosing her over strategic calculation, had given his life meaning for the first time since his father died. If that meaning killed him, so be it. At least he'd die human. "Thank you," Caedric said quietly, "for staying, for following, for not abandoning me when you should have. Thank you for finally giving me something worth dying for." Gareth clasped his shoulder once, then left to check defensive positions, and Caedric remained on the battlements calculating odds that wouldn't improve no matter how long he stared at them. Below, Thornhaven prepared for the end with the grim efficiency of people who'd stopped believing in miracles and started believing in making their deaths expensive. That was the North's real strength. Not hope, not faith, just the stubborn refusal to make things easy for enemies who assumed conquest was inevitable. Dawn of the third day arrived with fog thick enough to cut with a blade. Caedric stood in the courtyard surrounded by every person in Thornhaven capable of holding a weapon, looking at faces that ranged from terrified to resigned to grimly determined. Young soldiers who'd never seen real combat, veterans who'd seen too much, servants who'd been handed weapons and taught killing in 3 days what should take months. They were going to die today. Most of them. Maybe all of them. But they deserved honesty before the end. "Listen to me," Caedric's voice carried across the silent courtyard. "In a few hours, Cassian Thorn will assault these walls with 5,000 men. Professional soldiers. Trained, equipped, led by a commander who's never lost a siege." He paused. "We can't stop them. Can't hold the walls indefinitely. Can't survive through conventional defense." The silence deepened, but no one looked away. "But we can make them bleed, can make every inch they take cost lives they'll remember. Can prove that crushing the North requires more than sending armies and expecting surrender." Caedric met their eyes, one by one. "I won't lie to you. Most of us will die today. But we'll die proving that defiance is possible. That the Crown's power has limits. That monsters can choose humanity even when it destroys them." He drew his sword, scarred, notched, reliable, and raised it toward the walls. "When they breach the gates, we fight. Not because we'll win, but because some things matter more than survival. Because being free for one day is worth more than living as tools for people who see us as expendable." He lowered the blade. And because 20 years from now, when the next crisis comes, someone will remember that Thornhaven didn't kneel easily. Will remember that defiance, even doomed defiance, still matters. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a young soldier, barely 20, face pale with fear, raised his weapon. For Thornhaven. Another joined him. Then another. Within seconds, the entire courtyard was shouting the words like a prayer that might ward off death if spoken loudly enough. For Thornhaven, Caedric felt something break in his chest. Not hope, something deeper. The recognition that these people were about to die for his choice, and their willingness to do so was both the most humbling and most terrifying thing he'd ever experienced. This was Command's final lesson. Power didn't come from fear or strength or strategic brilliance. It came from people deciding you were worth dying for, and nothing in 20 years of ruling had prepared him for that responsibility. Positions, he said quietly. The garrison dispersed, moving to defensive positions with the discipline of soldiers who'd accepted their fate and decided to make it count. Serafina appeared beside him, dressed in leather armor they'd found in storage, hair pulled back, face set in an expression that mixed terror and determination in equal measure. "I'm fighting with you," she said before he could object. "No, yes." Her voice was firm. "I'm not hiding in some tower while you die defending walls. If this is the end, we face it together." "Those were your words. Stand by them," Caedric wanted to argue. Wanted to lock her somewhere safe where she might survive when the walls fell. But looking at her expression, he recognized the futility of protection when the person you're protecting refuses to be saved. She'd spent her entire life being treated as property. She wouldn't spend her final hours accepting it. "Stay close," he said quietly. "When the walls breach, stay with me. Don't get separated. I won't." They moved to the main gate where the first assault would hit hardest, and Caedric took his position at the front where commanders belonged when asking the impossible from soldiers. Around them, Thornhaven fell silent except for wind and distant sounds of Cassian's army preparing for assault. Then the drums started, slow, rhythmic, the sound of 5,000 men moving in formation, advancing through fog toward walls that would soon crumble under professional violence delivered with ruthless efficiency. This was it, the final battle, the end of everything Caedric had built over 20 years, and standing beside Serafina with 800 defenders at his back, Caedric felt something unexpected settle across his shoulders. Peace. Not acceptance of death, but peace with the choice that led here. He'd spent 20 years surviving through fear and isolation, and it had kept him alive but empty. Now he was going to die for connection and meaning and the simple truth that some things mattered more than power. That felt like redemption. Violent, tragic, but real. The fog parted and Cassian Thorne's army appeared like a vision from nightmare. Thousands of soldiers in perfect formation, siege equipment rolling forward, banners snapping in morning wind. Caedric raised his sword. "For Thornhaven," he said quietly. The response came as a roar that shook the walls themselves, and then the world exploded into violence. The assault came in waves designed to overwhelm through attrition. First wave was infantry with scaling ladders, expendable soldiers whose job was to die establishing footholds on the walls while archers provided covering fire. They hit the gates and walls simultaneously, screaming battle cries meant to terrify defenders into breaking. They underestimated northern stubbornness. Thornhaven's archers fired from elevated positions, dropping attackers before they reached the walls. Boiling oil poured from murder holes above the gates, turning the approach into a killing ground where men screamed and died in ways that would haunt survivors' dreams forever. But the waves kept coming. For every soldier Thornhaven killed, 3 more took their place. For every ladder burned, 2 more were raised. Cassian was spending lives with the ruthless pragmatism of a commander who had lives to spend and knew that eventually numbers would overwhelm courage. The first breach came at the eastern wall where sustained battering finally cracked ancient stone. Caedric heard the distinctive sound of walls crumbling, like bones breaking on a scale that made the earth itself scream, and knew the battle had shifted from defense to desperate survival. "Eastern wall is down," Gareth's voice carried through chaos. "They're pouring through. Hold them at the secondary line," Caedric shouted back. "Make them fight for every courtyard." But holding was relative when outnumbered 5-1. Enemy soldiers flooded through the breach, and Thornhaven's defenders met them with the desperate violence of people who'd stopped caring about survival and started caring about making their deaths count. Kedrick found himself in the center of close-quarters combat that was less battle and more mutual slaughter. His sword moved through patterns drilled into muscle memory: strike, pivot, kill, move, turning human beings into obstacles to be removed with mechanical efficiency. This was what 20 years of violence had made him. Not a man. A weapon that remembered being human just enough to mourn what it had become. Beside him, Serafina fought with surprising competence, using a short blade to exploit openings Kedrick created, covering his flank with the same cold calculation she'd used to survive her father's political games. They were losing ground. Slowly, inevitably, but losing. Thornhaven's defenders retreated through courtyards they'd defended for hours, leaving bodies behind. Friends, comrades, people who'd believed defiance mattered, each loss carving pieces from Kedrick's soul until he felt hollow, except for rage and grief. By midday, the battle had contracted to the central keep where the last defenders made their stand. Maybe 200 left, maybe less, all bleeding, all exhausted, all aware they were fighting the final minutes of a battle lost hours ago. Gareth appeared through smoke, face covered in blood, sword broken. "We can't hold the keep, too many breaching points." He met Kedrick's eyes. "This is it." "How long?" "Minutes. Maybe an hour, if we're lucky." Kedrick looked around the keep's main hall where wounded were gathered, where the last defenders prepared for the final assault, where Serafina stood with her blade ready and her expression set in grim determination. He'd led them here, made them believe resistance was possible, promised that defiance mattered even when doomed. Now they were paying for his pride with their lives. "Fall back to the throne room," Kedrick ordered. "Barricade the doors. Make them work for it." "And then what?" "Then we die defending what we built here, die proving we were worth the effort to destroy." Gareth nodded and moved to organize the retreat. Serafina stayed beside Kedrick, and her hand found his. "No regrets?" she asked quietly. "Thousands. But none about you. That's the nicest thing you've ever said that still sounds like a funeral." It's honest. They retreated to the throne room, the last defensible position, the final line that once crossed would end everything, and barricaded doors that would hold for maybe 10 minutes against sustained assault. Outside, Cassian's forces were organizing for the final push. The sounds of battle had changed from chaos to methodical execution. Room by room clearing. Professional soldiers eliminating the last pockets of resistance with the efficiency of men who'd done this dozens of times. This was the end. Kedrick stood in the throne room surrounded by maybe 50 survivors, all that remained of 800 who'd started the day, and felt the weight of command settle across his shoulders one final time. These people had followed him into doomed rebellion because they'd believed he was worth dying for. Now he had to prove they were right. "When the doors break, we charge," Kedrick said quietly. "Don't let them slaughter us cornered like animals. We go out fighting. We go out proving the North doesn't surrender." The survivors nodded, too exhausted for words, too broken for hope, just acceptance that this was the end and determination to make it memorable. The doors shuddered under the first impact. Battering ram, methodical, professional, inevitable. Second impact. Third. The barricade was failing. Kedrick raised his sword and looked at Serafina one final time. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." Her voice was steady. "See you on the other side, if there is one. If there is one." The doors exploded inward and Cassian's forces poured through. Kedrick charged with 50 survivors at his back, sword raised, voice roaring defiance that would either echo through history or be forgotten by dawn. And the world collapsed into final violence. Kedrick woke to silence. Not the silence of death, the absence of battle. The kind of quiet that came after storms when survivors emerged to assess damage and count the cost of survival. His body was agony incarnate. Broken ribs, sword cuts across his arms and torso. Something wrong with his left leg that sent fire through his nervous system with every breath. Blood, his and others, covered him like a second skin. But he was breathing. That seemed impossible. He tried to move and pain exploded white behind his eyes. Around him, the throne room looked like something from hell's deepest circle. Bodies everywhere, blood pooling across stone floors, the smell of death so thick it felt solid. And standing in the center of it all, watching him with an expression that mixed respect and exhaustion, was Cassian Thorne. The commander's armor was damaged. His face showed cuts and bruises. One arm hung at an odd angle, broken or dislocated. He looked like he'd been through the same battle Caedric barely survived. "You're alive," Cassian said quietly. Surprising. Caedric tried to speak, but his throat was too damaged. He managed a sound that might have been a question. "You fought like demons," Cassian continued, moving closer. "Killed hundreds. Made this the most expensive siege of my career." He paused. "Out of 5,000 men, maybe 3,000 are still combat effective. You cost me 2,000 casualties, taking a fortress defended by 800. Around them, Cassian's soldiers were moving through the throne room, separating living defenders from the dead, providing medical attention to those who might survive. Professional, efficient, lacking the cruelty that often followed hard-fought victories. "Where is she?" Caedric managed to rasp. "Seraphina!" Cassian gestured, and 2 soldiers brought her forward. Then she was alive, bleeding from a dozen wounds but conscious. When she saw Caedric, relief flooded her expression and she tried to pull away from her captors to reach him. The soldiers held firm. "Lady Seraphina Vale," Cassian said, "daughter of a traitor, accomplice to rebellion. By rights, I should execute her alongside you." He paused, studying them both. "But I'm tired. My men are tired. And burning through 2,000 lives to crush resistance has made me question whether the crown's justice is worth this cost." Caedric stared at him, not understanding. Cassian moved to a broken throne that had witnessed 20 years of harsh but stable rule, and sat with the weariness of someone who'd won but lost too much in the winning. "The crown sent me to make an example of you," he said, "to prove that rebellion leads to destruction, to show the realm what happens when subjects defy royal authority." He looked around the devastated throne room. "I think I've done that. The question is whether killing what's left serves any purpose beyond satisfying vengeance." "You're offering terms," Caedric rasped. "I'm offering reality." Cassian's voice was flat. "I can execute you both. Complete my orders. Return to the capital with your heads and the satisfaction of total victory. But I'll be returning with half my army dead and the north destabilized for a generation. Or what? Or I acknowledge that some men are too dangerous to kill because their death creates martyrs." Cassian met his eyes. "You held this region stable for 20 years through brutal competence. Kept the north from tearing itself apart. The crown might despise you, but they need what you provide. What are you suggesting? That you kneel. Formally submit to the crown's authority. Accept punishment, exile, title stripping, whatever face-saving measure allows the king to claim victory. In exchange," he gestured to Seraphina, "she lives. You live. And the north remains stable because the monster they fear continues governing under crown supervision instead of being replaced by some incompetent noble who'll get everyone killed through idiocy." It was surrender disguised as pragmatism. Caedric had defied the crown, started a rebellion, killed thousands of royal soldiers, and Cassian was offering him a way to survive because executing him would create more problems than it solved. That was realpolitik at its most cynical and its most honest. "What punishment?" Caedric asked. "Public submission. You kneel before the king, acknowledge your rebellion was wrong, accept whatever title demotion preserves royal dignity. Then you return here and continue governing exactly as before but with crown oversight." Cassian's expression was grim. "You lose independence, gain supervision, but you keep your life and the woman you love survives. And if I refuse, then I fulfill my orders. Execute you. Execute her. Install whoever the crown sends to replace you and watch the north collapse within a year." Cassian stood, wincing at injuries sustained during battle. "Choose quickly. My patience and my mercy both have limits." Caedric looked at Seraphina, who was staring at him with an expression that mixed horror and understanding. She knew what he was calculating. Accepting meant surrendering everything he'd fought for, meant kneeling before the authority he'd defied, meant admitting that rebellion was futile and resistance only led to submission under worse terms. But it also meant she lived, meant the North remained stable instead of descending into chaos, meant proving that sometimes survival required swallowing pride and accepting that perfect defiance was luxury. People with responsibilities couldn't afford. 20 years ago, Caedric would have chosen death over submission. Now, looking at Serafina, he realized that dying for pride was easy. Living with compromise was the harder choice, and the braver one. "I accept," Kedrick said quietly. Cassian nodded. "Then kneel." With every injury screaming protest, Kedrick forced himself to his knees before the man who'd come to destroy him. It was agony, humiliation, the final surrender of everything he'd built rebellion to avoid, but it was also survival. Survival for Serafina. Survival for the North. Survival for the idea that sometimes choosing life over pride was the most defiant act possible. "I submit to the Crown's authority," Kedrick said, each word feeling like swallowing glass. "I acknowledge my rebellion. I accept whatever judgment preserves the realm's stability." Cassian studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Respect. Recognition. The look of one professional acknowledging another. "Rise, Duke Ashmont, or whatever title the king leaves you when this is over." Kedrick stood with Gareth's help. The captain had survived, barely, and was being treated by Cassian's field surgeons, and felt the weight of defeat settle across his shoulders like armor made of consequence. He'd lost, surrendered, accepted terms that made his rebellion meaningless. But Serafina was alive. The North would remain stable, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes survival was the victory. 3 months later, Kedrick stood in the capital's throne room wearing chains and humiliation in equal measure. The king sat on a throne that looked like something designed to crush the soul through architecture alone. Massive, ornate, positioned above everyone to remind subjects of their proper place in hierarchy. Around the chamber, nobles watched with expressions ranging from satisfaction to disgust to grudging respect. Kedrick had been brought here to kneel again, to formally accept punishment before the entire court, so everyone could witness what happened to subjects who defied royal authority. It was political theater designed to restore the illusion of control, and Kedrick was the actor forced to perform his own humiliation. "Duke Kedrick Ashmont," the king's voice carried across the silent chamber. "You raised rebellion against the crown, defied royal summons, killed loyal soldiers, destroyed property, caused chaos that required military intervention to resolve." Kedrick remained silent. This wasn't a conversation, it was sentencing. "For these crimes, you are stripped of your title as Duke. Your lands are forfeit to the crown. Your family name is stained." The king paused for effect. "However, in recognition of your service to the realm and the necessity of stable governance in the northern territories, you will be reinstated as Lord Commander of the North, a military position with limited authority and full accountability to crown oversight." So he'd lost his title but kept his position. Lost independence but maintained function. It was the same governing role with different packaging designed to preserve royal dignity while acknowledging practical necessity. Kedrick had spent 20 years as Duke ruling through fear and autonomy. Now he'd spend the rest of his life as Lord Commander ruling through compromise and supervision. It felt like death by slow suffocation. But Serafina was alive, sitting in the gallery watching with an expression that mixed relief and sorrow. The crown had allowed her to remain free, married her to Kedrick officially, recognizing their relationship as legitimate now that he'd submitted, and that made everything else bearable. He'd traded pride for her life, would make that trade again without hesitation. "Do you accept these terms?" the king asked. "I do." "Then let it be recorded that rebellion leads to diminishment, that defiance results in submission, that the crown's authority is absolute." The king stood. "You are dismissed, Lord Commander. Return to your posting and remember the cost of pride." Kedrick rose, bowed with the minimum courtesy required, and left the throne room with Serafina at his side. Behind them, nobles whispered about his fall from power, about how the mighty duke had been broken, about how rebellion only led to humiliation. They didn't understand that surviving to fight another day was sometimes the most defiant choice possible, that accepting defeat with dignity was harder than dying with pride, that choosing life with the person you loved over death for principles was the real victory. Kedrick had spent 20 years being the realm's monster. Now he was learning to be human, and humanity, he was discovering, required different kinds of strength than monstrosity ever had. Check. The journey back to Thornhaven took 2 weeks through mountain passes that felt like traveling backward through time to a life that no longer existed. The fortress stood scarred but standing, walls repaired, Courtyards cleaned of blood. Garrison restored with soldiers who'd survived or been recruited to replace those lost. Everything looked the same from distance, but everything had changed. Caedric was no longer Duke, no longer autonomous. Every decision now required crown approval. Every action was monitored by overseers sent north to ensure compliance. He traded absolute authority for supervised existence. It should have felt like prison. Instead, it felt like freedom. Because power without purpose was just weight crushing you into shapes you didn't recognize. And he'd been crushed so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to choose based on what mattered instead of what was strategic. Seraphina stood beside him on the battlements where this entire nightmare had started months ago, and her hand found his with the casual certainty of someone who'd chosen him repeatedly when leaving would have been smarter. "Regrets?" she asked quietly. "Thousands. But none about you." "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." They watched the sun set over territories Caedric had governed for 20 years with brutal competence and would now govern with brutal compromise. Nothing had changed except everything. He'd lost his title, lost his independence, lost the fear-based authority that had kept enemies at distance. But he'd gained something more valuable: connection, purpose. The simple truth that survival without meaning was just slow death, and he'd been dying slowly for 2 decades before Seraphina arrived and reminded him what living felt like. "I love you," Caedric said quietly. "I know." Seraphina leaned against him. "That's why I stayed. Why I keep staying. Because loving you, even when it gets us both nearly killed, is better than existing safely alone." That's the worst romantic speech I've ever heard. It's honest. They stood together as darkness claimed the northern territories, and wind carried the first hints of winter that would be harsh and unforgiving and exactly like every winter before it. But this time, Caedric wouldn't face it alone. This time, he had someone who refused to let him retreat into isolation when things got difficult. This time, he had a reason to keep fighting that wasn't about power or survival or maintaining control. He had connection, and connection, he was learning, was worth more than any title or territory or illusion of autonomy. Below them, Thornhaven settled into evening routines. Guards changed shifts. Servants completed their duties. Life continued with the resilient stubbornness of things that refused to die even when logic said they should. That was the North's real strength, not power, not fear, not brutal competence, just the stubborn refusal to let circumstances define who you became. And standing on the battlements with Seraphina at his side, Caedric Ashmont realized that he'd spent 20 years being the realm's monster because he thought that's what survival required. He'd been wrong. Survival required adaptation, required learning that strength came in forms other than domination, required accepting that being human was harder than being a weapon, but infinitely more valuable. He'd lost everything he'd built through fear, and gained everything that mattered through love. That felt like the ending he deserved: violent, compromised, imperfect, but real. And after 20 years of existing in isolation, real was enough. The wind carried voices from the courtyard below, soldiers laughing, servants gossiping, life continuing despite devastation. And Caedric felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive kind that believed everything would work out perfectly, but the defiant kind that said even when circumstances crushed you, even when you lost everything you thought mattered, you could still choose what to become in the aftermath. You could still choose humanity over monstrosity, connection over isolation, love over power. And sometimes that choice was the real victory. Sometimes surviving to make that choice was the point all along. "What are you thinking?" Seraphina asked. "That I spent 20 years terrified of this exact scenario, losing power, losing independence, being forced to accept limitations." Caedric pulled her closer. "And now that it's happened, I'm discovering it's not as terrifying as I thought. Because I have you, and that's worth more than any title or territory or illusion of control. You're getting soft in your old age. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally learning what strength actually looks like. And what does it look like? Like choosing life with you over death for pride. Like accepting defeat without surrendering humanity. Like surviving long enough to learn that the things I thought were weaknesses, connection, compromise, caring, were actually the only things that mattered." Seraphina was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "That's the most philosophical thing you've ever said. Don't get used to it." "I'm still a bastard. I know. That's why I love you. They stood together as night claimed Thornhaven and stars appeared overhead like witnesses to everything that had happened and everything that would come next. Caedric had been the Duke of the Northern Territories, the realm's monster, the crown's weapon. Now he was just a man who'd chosen love over power and survived long enough to discover that was the harder path, the braver path, the only path that actually mattered. And standing there with Seraphina in his arms, Caedric Ashmont felt something settle in his chest that had been absent for 20 years. Peace, not acceptance of circumstances, but peace with who he'd become through them. He'd been broken, rebuilt, broken again. And somewhere in that cycle of destruction and survival, he'd learned the truth that power could never teach. That being human required courage that domination never demanded. That love was stronger than fear because fear only controlled behavior, while love changed who you were. That sometimes losing everything was the price of finding what actually mattered. Below them, Thornhaven slept, scarred, diminished, but alive, just like them. And as winter winds carried the promise of harsher days ahead, Caedric held the woman who'd refused to let him die alone and made a promise to himself. He would govern these territories with the same brutal competence the North required. Would protect the people who'd chosen to follow him even when following meant dying, would prove that men who'd been monsters could learn to be human without losing the strength that made them worth following. But he would never again mistake power for purpose, never again confuse isolation for safety, never again believe that surviving without meaning was the same as living. He'd spent 20 years learning how to be the realm's weapon. Now he'd spend the rest of his life learning how to be Seraphina's husband. And somehow, that felt like the harder challenge and the greater victory in equal measure. The night deepened. The stars watched. And in the fortress that had witnessed 20 years of harsh rule and brutal compromise, two people who'd survived everything the realm could throw at them stood together and chose the future over the past, chose connection over isolation, chose love over power, chose humanity over monstrosity. And in that choice, found something stronger than any title or territory or illusion of control could ever provide. They found each other, and that was enough. That was everything. That was the ending they'd earned through blood and compromise, and the kind of stubborn defiance that refused to accept that survival was the only goal worth pursuing. Because surviving was easy. Living was the real challenge, and they'd both finally learned the difference.